A young woman walks down an alleyway on her way home from college, illuminated only in small puddles of light by the lamps above her. Little does she know that a man will be waiting for her as she emerges into the car park. Poor soul, she thinks after seeing that well-dressed man is struggling to carry books to his Volkswagen Beetle, especially as one of his arms is in a sling. She walks over to him and offers assistance, to which the polite and softly spoken man gives her his utmost thanks. As she takes some of the books and leans down to place them in the passenger seat, he hits her over the head with a tire iron. He gets into the driver's seat and leaves the scene. He'll strangle her like he did many others. He'll do unspeakable things to her. He is the quintessential maniac. His name is Ted Bundy. The scene we've just described to you was the modus operandi of this particular serial killer. Well, when he had planned his murders. Bundy's thing was to use his good looks, his speaking skills, and his educated demeanor to lure people into his trap. At times, he'd put his arm in a sling or even walk on crutches to give his victims a false sense of security. How harmful could a man be on crutches, one dressed in a suit, driving a cute car? This is why he was so hard to catch. He just didn't fit the profile of a serial killer, one who did absolutely disgusting things to people at the moment they died and after they died. He probably should have been caught much earlier than he was. After all, when young women went out and never came back, on a few occasions witnesses came forward and said they had seen a man lurking around, a man with one arm in a sling, a man that drove a VW Bug. 22-year-old Brenda Carol Ball was last seen talking to a guy in a car park who had brown hair and an arm in a sling. Soon after, Susan Elaine Rancourt went missing, never to return. 2 people came forward after that and said they'd been approached by a man who wore a sling. He'd asked them for help putting some books into his car, a VW Beetle. Then, on June 11, 1974, University of Washington student Georgianne Hawkins went missing. Her body would never be found. We know that she'd been with her boyfriend and she left him after midnight. On her walk home to her sorority house, she was spotted by a male friend who was driving a car. He shouted out of the window, "Hey George, what's happening?" She chatted with him for a minute or two and expressed that she was a bit nervous about her upcoming Spanish exam. Later, witnesses told the cops that they'd seen some guy skulking around in an alleyway close to Hawkins's, a guy whose arm was in a sling. One woman said he'd asked her to help him load a briefcase into a light brown Volkswagen Beetle. Little did she know at the time how close she was to being murdered. Hawkins wasn't so lucky. She fell for the trick, as any helpful person might. We know what happened to her because Bundy later talked about it. When she was close enough to his car, he hit her over the head with a crowbar, which knocked her clean out. When she came around, she was obviously confused, although to Bundy's surprise, she seemed to think that he'd turned up to help her with Spanish. She was evidently in shock. This is what Bundy said about that. It's odd the kinds of things people will say under those circumstances. He strangled her and dumped her body, a body he would return to on at least 3 occasions. You can only imagine how demented he was returning to a body that was decomposing. He had his reasons, but we'll get to that. Bundy was brazen, there's no doubt about it. He didn't ever think he'd be caught. He thought he was too intelligent for the police. After all, he'd worked in politics. He worked as an assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee, where he wrote a paper on rape prevention. He did a stint at the Department of Emergency Services, where he talked about missing women and how to find them. And that's likely why Bundy didn't have any qualms about returning to the alleyway from where he'd picked up Hawkins. The day after the abduction, he was there at the same time as the police, hiding in plain sight as he picked up one of the girl's shoes and her necklace. If he wasn't picking up girls in a car park or close by one, he was sneaking into basements while they slept and then bludgeoning the victim with some kind of iron bar. Bundy was like the boogeyman, a serial killer that crawled through windows and viciously attacked people while they were at their most vulnerable. But he was also a con artist. He played confidence tricks and he was very good at it. Investigators knew that when girls went missing, at times a man was seen with an arm in a sling, a man that owned a VW Beetle. Surely Bundy was easy prey after that. How many VW Beetles were there in those areas when the abduction happened? Areas dotted around the Pacific Northwest. The reality was Bundy's reign of terror was only in the early stages. The public and police were worried, that's for sure. Young folks stopped hitching rides and many became fearful of talking to strangers or leaving their windows open at night. Those with most to fear were young white women. Bundy's victims were almost always in their late teens or early 20s. They were Caucasian, and most of them were attractive. They studied at university and were said to be intelligent and gifted students. Another thing was the fact that each girl disappeared at a college where construction work was going on. Could the disappearances be linked? Wondered investigators. They just didn't know. They had very little forensic evidence to work with, and there were no bodies. That didn't mean the cops thought the girls had just taken off someplace. Nothing about their personalities and state of mind suggested that. Only weeks after Hawkins went missing, 2 women were abducted in broad daylight at Lake Sammamish State Park, not far from the city of Seattle. Bundy had first approached 5 women in the park, and in what they later described as a Canadian or British accent, the man introduced himself as Ted. Ted, dressed in a pressed white tennis outfit with one arm in a sling, politely asked them if they could help him unload a sailboat from his bronze-colored Volkswagen Beetle. 4 of them said no, but one followed him to his car. Thankfully, she ran away when she became aware that there was no sailboat. That day, Bundy managed to enlist 1 woman for help, and he later abducted another close to a restroom. Both would die. Did he kill one in front of the other? He once said that that was true, but close to his execution date, he recanted that terribly bleak detail. This is not a story about his crimes, though. What we want to know is how the hell did the police not get closer to Bundy, seeing as he was using the same car and the same sling trick, and so the same modus operandi? He even told the girls that escaped that he was named Ted. What more did the cops need? A written confession? They were closer, but still a long way from getting him. They at least now had good description of this Ted guy, and it did quite look like him. In no time at all, this sketch appeared in many newspapers and was shown on TV. Remember that we said Bundy worked at the Department of Emergency Services? Well, one of his co-workers there saw the sketch and heard about the Volkswagen Beetle, and she knew she was looking at her colleague, Mr. Bundy. She made a call to the cops, as did another person that knew Ted Bundy. The cops at the time were receiving something like 200 of these calls in one day, and they quickly assumed that a clean-cut law student with no criminal record couldn't be behind the abductions. Serial killers didn't look like that, or so they thought. The heat was on though, and Bundy knew it. A couple of months after his last murder, bones were being found. Those bones were the remains of his victims, scattered in various places where the cops hadn't thought to look. It was fortunate for Bundy then that he was accepted to study at the University of Utah Law School. He packed his bags and headed south in August of '74. He was only in Utah a month when he started killing again. September 2nd, a hitchhiker. October 2nd, a 16-year-old girl. October 18th, a 17-year-old girl from a pizza parlor. It turned out that she was the daughter of a police chief. After her decomposing body was found on a hiking trail, the post-mortem exam revealed that Bundy had kept her alive for perhaps 7 days. Each had been subjected to the most brutal depravity, although Bundy admitted years later that after he killed them, he shampooed their hair and applied makeup to their faces, keeping them in a state that he liked. He wanted the physical possession of the remains, and he wanted to do what he wanted to them. He sometimes chopped them, sometimes kept heads in his apartment, and he dressed them in the way he wanted them to look. And then he took a photograph. When you work hard to do something right, he once said, you don't want to forget it. More abductions happened, more murders, as well as attempted abductions. The disappearances were reported in the media, and after reading about them, a woman named Elizabeth Klepfer, who dated Bundy back when he was in Washington, put 2 and 2 together. She not only called the King County cops and told them that she thought she had been dating the killer, but she also told the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office and said the same. She was still talking to Bundy at this point on the telephone, but she didn't say anything about her calls. For her, the sketch looked like Ted Bundy. The car was Bundy's, and so the murders following him around were just too much of a coincidence. Bundy started then killing in Colorado. Things didn't change much. Death by blunt force trauma, sometimes strangulation, bodies dumped, mutilated, sometimes wearing clothes that weren't theirs. 1975 drew to an end and there were more victims, some whose bodies have never been found. 76 turned out to be another bloody year, so how come Washington cops weren't at the very least looking at Bundy? They only did that after they discovered a new toy, a computer and a database. They found that they could input data about the murders and the computer would compare that data to data already in the system. Thousands of names were in that database, but only 26 names matched the crimes. Bundy's was one of them. The problem was connecting the Utah and Colorado murders to the Pacific Northwest murders. At the time, there were no large databases containing all the state's police departments. The fact of the matter was, while the cops should have known better after the tip-offs, because Bundy moved around, he managed to evade capture. But then, he was pulled over by a cop in a Salt Lake City suburb after he'd been driving around looking suspicious. On searching Bundy's car, the cop found quite the collection of suspicious items: a ski mask, trash bags, handcuffs, a crowbar, lengths of rope, and an ice pick. All that was pretty much the consummate serial killer's stash. It didn't take long for the cops to understand that they might have a maniac on their hands, and they had the phone call from Bundy's lover in their records, and they had his car description from one of the abductions. Still, after searching his house, the police didn't have enough to keep him. One thing they didn't find that day was a bunch of photographs of his dead victims. Things would have been very different had they discovered those awful snaps. Bundy was on the loose again, but he was being monitored all day long. Some of the cops flew to Seattle to speak to Bundy's lover. She told him that some things just didn't add up, such as why did he keep crutches in his house? And what about that plaster of Paris? Not to mention the surgical gloves, big knives, meat cleaver, and a bag full of women's clothes. Bundy was certainly in a fix now, but he was by no means done. He sold his beloved Beetle, but that was soon sequestered by investigators who gave the interior a good going over. What they found were strands of hair from females, and those females were very likely victims of murder. Police brought Bundy in and put him in a lineup, but they only had enough evidence to possibly put him on trial for aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. His parents paid his $15,000 bail and off he went, once again, a free man, but under heavy round-the-clock surveillance. He actually lived with his lover again while he was on bail, which should have been a very strange time for her. At this point, the lead investigators from Utah, Washington, and Colorado all finally got together and shared their stories and what evidence they had. They were pretty darn sure that they had a serial killer on their hands, and an utterly depraved one at that. Before they could get him for murder, though, he faced trial for kidnapping and assault. He was found guilty and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. While in there, he was charged with just one of the murders. Bundy was a desperate man around this time, likely knowing that his crimes or most of them would catch up with him and he'd be looking at the death penalty. He chose to defend himself, and because of that, he didn't have to wear handcuffs or leg shackles in court. On one of those court appearances, he managed to convince the court he needed the library and he leapt from a window. He actually survived for 6 days around the wilderness of the Aspen Mountains, but was eventually picked up by the cops. The case against him for that one murder was actually quite weak, but it seemed that Bundy believed they would get him. If he was done for that case, more cases might follow. Over a period of 6 months, he got his hands on a floor plan of the jail. He saved money after getting it smuggled in by visitors, and he also got himself a hacksaw. On December 30th, 1977, Bundy filled his bed with books, so it might look like he was sleeping. He then got through the ceiling and into an apartment. There, he changed into civilian clothes and then he walked out of the jail. He went from Chicago to Atlanta to Florida in stolen cars, only stopping to steal certain items or wallets from people. On January 15, 1978, he walked around at night in Florida State University. In the early hours of the morning, he assaulted, bludgeoned, strangled, and bit 3 sleeping women in 3 different rooms, all within about 15 minutes. 2 of them survived but were very badly injured. He left the sorority house and went to an apartment building where he viciously attacked another girl, fracturing her skull and jaw. There, he left behind one of his favorite things, his pantyhose mask. Police also found sperm and hair samples. Bundy later drove to Jacksonville where he abducted and killed a 12-year-old girl. A few days later, he was stopped by a police officer. During questioning, he kicked the man's legs and ran for it. The cop fired warning shots, but Bundy kept running. He was too slow, he was tackled, and in spite of his best efforts, he couldn't get the gun from the cop. Bundy was done for, sat in a car, handcuffed, on his way to certain death. Still, this Florida policeman didn't know who he had in the car. He was not aware that he was carrying one of the USA's most wanted fugitives. He certainly had no idea that the occupant of his vehicle would become known as one of the worst, most vile serial killers of all time. A demon whose warped brutality knew no bounds. And do you know what Bundy said to the cop while he was in the car? He said, "I wish you had killed me." Eventually, he confessed to 30 murders, but there could have been many more. On January 24, 1989, age 42, Bundy took his final breaths in the electric chair. His last words were, "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." Welcome back to our macabre series of shows featuring some of the worst things people have done to each other in the name of punishment. While in other shows we've talked about instruments of torture and killing that could be said to be basic. Claws that rip flesh, cudgels that smash bones. This particular instrument of horrifyingly inhumane torture could be said to have been cooked up by creative folks. As with just about anything we've talked about in this series, it would be unimaginable to suffer this treatment. But hey, we aren't going to say it's any worse than having your intestines chewed on by starving rats. Like that punishment though, this one was slow, making hanging or head chopping seem very merciful in comparison. This form of execution was created by the ancient Greeks. It had a few names and it might also be called the Bronze Bull or the Sicilian Bull, but how do we know anything about it at all? One of the answers is because it was written about in something called the Bibliotheca Historica, which translates as historical library. It consists of many books written by an ancient Greek historian named Diodorus Siculus. In these books, you'll find his version of the history of the world, from what went down in ancient Egypt to the leader Alexander the Great. Quite a lot of it is still intact, but some parts in the series are missing or in fragments. In one of these books, Mr. Siculus wrote about the Brazen Bull, and this is what he said. The guy who invented it was an inventor by trade, and he was named Perilos of Athens. It's said before he built this thing somewhere between 570 and 554 BC, he actually pitched the idea. He was what you might call a creative technologist of the past, looking for some funding. He got that funding from a man named Phalaris, the tyrant of Acragas. Given his frightening title, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that this man was said to be very cruel. In some accounts of his life, it's written that he enjoyed torture and even went so low as to eat children. We should say that Encyclopedia Britannica cites research that says he wasn't as cruel as some people have written. Whatever the case, it seems he commissioned the building of the Brazen Bull. So how did one perish in a Brazen Bull? Well, it was certainly a thing conjured up by a creative yet sadistic imagination. It was said to be the same size of a bull but shaped from bronze, with an opening where a man could enter the thing. A fire was then lit under the bull and the man would slowly roast to death. But get this, it was made so that when the man was howling in agony, his shrieks would emanate through specially distorted pipes built into the bull, so the impression an onlooker would get was an animal bellowing in pain. This might have been the fun part for someone like the tyrant of Acragas. The smoke would come out through the holes in the bull's nose, and that nose was filled with incense, since burning bodies don't smell so good. The bones that were left would then be turned into bracelets, so the story goes. When the idea was pitched by Perilos, it's said he said this to the tyrant Phalaris. The occupant will shriek and roar in unremitting agony, and his cries will come to you through the pipes as the tenderest, most pathetic, most melodious of bellowings. Your victim will be punished, and you will enjoy the music. When the bull was finished, Phalaris told the inventor to get inside the thing to test out the sound, but some sources say he lit the fire and the inventor died there. Others say he pulled him out, but then killed him by pushing him over a cliff. It seems for all his hard work, Perilos was killed, but perhaps not because Phalaris didn't want to pay. Even though Phalaris is said to have been keen on cruelty, it's written that he said this to Perilos after hearing about the execution method. His words revolted me. I loathed the thought of such ingenious cruelty and resolved to punish the artificer in kind. I said to him, if your art can really produce this effect, get inside yourself and pretend to roar, and we'll see whether the pipes will make such music as you describe. By the way, it's written that upon his downfall, Phalaris was also killed inside the bull. So that's inventor and commissioner both killed at their own hands in a way. Word of the Brazen Bull was passed down and histories were written, and they linked the device with these two men, the inventor and the tyrant. But the history of the bull doesn't stop there. The Romans, it said, had a taste for the Brazen Bull, and if you've watched our other shows on Roman torture, you won't be surprised to hear that some people wouldn't have had many scruples about roasting a man to death and enjoying his screams. We might look at the story of a man named Saint Eustace. It's said he became a martyr after being killed in the 2nd century. The Romans were punishing many Christians before they themselves converted to Christianity under the Emperor Constantine, but that was in the 4th century AD, before a lot of Christian blood was spilled, and it seems a few Christians also got cooked to death inside a bronze animal. Saint Eustace was said to have been one of them. Before he converted to Christianity, he had served under a Roman emperor, but he saw the light, so to speak, when he had a vision one day, which involved a stag and a crucifix. Christians might tell you that this man then lost everything, which was one of those tests of God. He lost his cash, his servants, and his wife and kids were taken away from him by, of all things, a lion and a wolf. Yet his faith remained strong throughout. There are a few different stories as to what happened to this man, but some people will tell you he got his wealth back as well as his family, but in the end, he, his wife, and children were all roasted to death in the Brazen Bull on the orders of Emperor Hadrian. We looked at some Christian sources and they seem to back that up, although they don't say his family got the treatment too. We also found this piece of Christian history written in the 1800s. It seems to suggest that when Eustace and his family got roasted, they died, but some miracles did happen. This is from that text. The holy martyrs, by divine power, remained alive for 3 days, praising and blessing the great giver of life and death. At last, when their voices ceased, the bull was opened, and all 4 were found without life, but also without any injury to their bodies or garments. It's written that other Christians close to him at this time went the same way. For instance, a man known as Saint Antipas. This was written about him. They became enraged and dragged him to the Temple of Artemis, and there they threw him into a glowing red-hot copper or brazen metal bowl, where they normally put their sacrifices to the idols to cast demons out of their own people. He loudly prayed God to receive his soul and strengthen the faith of the Christians, and begged God to forgive those who were inflicting on him his torment. He then departed as peacefully as if he fell asleep. We should say that there are a lot of people who don't believe these stories and relate them more to legend than truth. It's not for us to say what's true or not. But most serious historians will at least tell you that the stories from the bull's surprising beginnings in Greece to Christian martyrs not feeling any pain while being roasted are hard to verify. What is very much true is that stories of the Brazen Bull have been passed down throughout the ages, and those manuscripts can still be read today. By the way, while you might see a Brazen Bull in a museum in the world, it won't be the real thing, only a depiction of one. June 11, 1969, Baria City, Vung Tau Province, Vietnam. A newbie tunnel rat arrived at the base to a scene of utter destruction. Just days earlier, a platoon was hit by an M16 mine, aka the Jumping Jack. It got that name for the way it jumped in the air when stepped on. It killed 3 men and injured 24 others. Not long after the hidden enemy laid an anti-personnel mine, a personnel carrier hit that mine. It was the first time that the unseasoned tunnel rat saw a dead body. It was chaos, each and every day. He had to learn fast. The #1 tunnel rat, nicknamed Yogi, was hit twice by mines. Bits were hanging off him as he told the newbie what he had to do next. This was not a job for the faint of heart, but someone had to do it. That story is true. It happened to a combat engineer in the Australian Army. He took on one of the hardest and scariest roles in the war, that of a tunnel rat. We'll get back to his story, but first, let's talk about the job. Prior to the Americans going to war with the Viet Cong, the French fought the Viet Minh from 1946 to 1954. During that time, the Viet Minh learned a thing or two about fighting a superpower. To beat someone far more powerful than yourself, you had to resort to guerrilla tactics. One of those tactics was keeping below ground, and so the Viet Minh got to work building a massive complex of tunnels. When the Americans arrived in 1955, the tunnels were already vast, but it was the Viet Cong that really made them a feat of engineering. During the Vietnam War, or the American War to the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong used those tunnels for all kinds of things. While the opening to the tunnels was small, they might lead to a complex system of tunnels that would lead to large underground spaces. It was within these spaces that the Viet Cong would hide, eat, sleep, and machinate attacks on their enemy. The tunnels served as headquarters, hospitals, barracks, and storage facilities. Since they had ventilation systems, it was possible to stay down there for a prolonged period of time. So we're not so much talking about men burrowing like rabbits, but men living in a subterranean world. These worlds provided safety from the hostiles. Like snakes, the men would come out of them at night, lay traps for the enemy, and sneak back into the tunnel. And that's how so many American and Australian soldiers lost their lives, to mine-laying soldiers that were rarely seen above ground. It was actually an Australian combat engineering unit, the 3 Field Force, that were the first tunnel rats. The Americans later joined them, but we don't imagine guys were queuing up for the job. Just imagine it. They find the entrance but have no idea where the tunnel will lead or who they will encounter down there. That wasn't the only threat of humans to worry about, too. Vietnam is in the tropics, and the tropics are home to all kinds of dangerous creatures. Have you ever seen a Vietnamese giant centipede? Those fast-moving, prehistoric-looking creatures deliver one of the most painful insect bites known to man. And guess what? They too like to hide in tunnels. Then there were the snakes, the highly venomous and deadly banded krait, the malignant pit viper, the king cobra, and a whole host of other badass snakes that can spoil a person's day. The soldiers had to deal with ants' nests, annoying bats, rats carrying the bubonic plague, as well as spiders that weren't generally a threat to life, but could make life painful. So you can imagine that going into one of those tunnels was about as frightening as getting into Ted Bundy's Volkswagen Beetle, but they had to do it, lest more men get blown to bits by these damned jumping jack mines. If the men can infiltrate the tunnels, they might not only kill a few of the enemy, but they would usually come across a stash of mines, grenades, and guns. There was another problem concerning arms. The tunnels were small, and so that meant that the tunnel rats couldn't take larger guns down them. They were usually only equipped with an M1911 pistol or an M1917 revolver. They'd also have a flashlight, a knife, and usually some explosives so they could blow up whatever they found down there. You can just picture it, a man crawling through the darkness, his flashlight in one hand and his pistol in the other. He crawls and crawls, and then he sees the enemy. He shoots, and then all he can hear is ringing in his ears. He's blinded by the flash and deafened by the noise. Then the earth above his head starts to fall. He needs to get out fast. What he doesn't know is that the Viet Cong have something special for him: poisonous gas. And this tunnel rat didn't choose the gas mask option because the last time he wore one he could barely see. If the gas doesn't get him, the flood will. The Viet Cong designed this particular tunnel with a flooding feature if it should ever be infiltrated. Other times, the tunnel might just collapse, which wasn't a design feature but a case of poor construction. You'd have to be crazy to do this job. You also had to be short. Imagine a hulk of a man with quite the belly trying to navigate around a tunnel. Soldiers that were picked for the job were usually not taller than 165 centimeters. It was the same years later when the US Marine Corps and British Royal Marines fought in the Afghanistan War. Yeah, tunnel rats weren't only a thing in Vietnam. But let's stay with Vietnam for now and go back to the Australian soldier. He was trained at the Australian Army's School of Military Engineering. He actually thought that this line of study would mean he'd be facing less combat and doing more engineering. He was wrong. He was being trained to become a tunnel rat. That meant learning about things such as mine detection, disarming booby traps, safely blowing stuff up, and learning how to get through tunnels. When he arrived in Vietnam, he walked into chaos. As we said, one of the first things he saw was the aftermath of a soldier stepping on a jumping jack mine. 3 bodies were outfitted with body bags, and after that, 24 men were wounded. He said those M16 mines were everywhere, and it was part of his job to find them. What the Viet Cong did was store them in the tunnels and then lay them at night. So each day was a new day, and there was always a possibility of new mines lying around. That's why the tunnel rat had such an important job. Find where the mines were stored and blow up the tunnel, and then no more mines. When he started the job, he worked as a tunnel rat number 2. He worked in a pair with tunnel rat number 1, and when 6 months was up, he became number 1, and he was joined by a newbie. He hadn't been a number 2 for long when he heard that a number 1 tunnel rat named Yogi had stood on a mine. Yogi was alive, but as you can imagine, he wasn't looking too well. In fact, only 3 Australians that stood on mines made it back home with their legs and lives intact. Yogi was one of them. He was lucky. The fatality rate in his unit was 33%. That's one reason why going into tunnels was not a prospect most soldiers liked. The Americans wanted to destroy the tunnels not from the inside but from the outside. If you dropped enough bombs on suspected tunnels, then they would cave in and anyone inside would suffocate. If you sprayed poisonous gases into them, the Viet Cong would die. You could also try and flood the area where the tunnels were, and by doing that, drown the enemy. The problem was that these efforts didn't always result in success. The reason for that was the fact that the Viet Cong made more impressive tunnels. They made them blast-proof, flood-proof, and provided extra ventilation so the gases weren't effective. They also made them in a zigzag shape to mitigate the effect of an explosion. This is why the tunnel rat was indispensable. Those guys were the only thing that really worked. Believe it or not, most American soldiers were not chosen to do this job, but actually volunteered. Most soldiers thought you'd have to be out of your mind to do the work. The centipedes and the snakes were one thing, but suffocation in a collapsed tunnel was something from a nightmare. So why did they volunteer? One soldier back then said it was sometimes a macho thing. Soldiers did it to show others just how tough they were. He said that many tunnel rats had had problematic lives back home in the US, so they wanted to show that they could be useful. And useful they were, as well as brave. One tunnel rat named C.W. Bowman said that his fellow soldiers thought he was a maniac doing the job. He said they took bets each time he went into a tunnel, and some men betted that he would die. Some men almost did, and this would become a weakness for the US military. We'll get around to that soon. Let's first take you through a mission. You shoot first and ask questions later. That was the mantra of the tunnel rat. Anything they came across, they shot at. They would usually fire only 3 bullets and then reload. The reason for this was the enemy wouldn't know how many bullets they had in the chamber. Let's say the mission was successful, and that the tunnel rat took out the enemy and discovered what was hidden down there. What would they find? On one mission, the tunnel was around 120 feet. At the end of the tunnel, the rat found places where men cooked and slept. As for items, he discovered 8 rifle grenades, 40 pounds of salt, and 6,000 pounds of rice, all of which was destroyed. On another mission, the tunnel rats found cameras, films, and printing presses, as well as weapons and ammunition. There was still a problem though, and that was the fact that even if the tunnel rats were successful, the Americans still had a problem winning the war. You can take out the tunnel, but there will always be more. This is a quote from Ho Chi Minh, the president of North Vietnam. You can kill 10 of our men for every 1 we kill of yours, but even at those odds, you will lose and we will win. Take for instance the use of booby traps, horrific things that killed around 11% of American soldiers during the war. Sometimes the Viet Cong would put a punji stake trap in a larger part of the tunnel. These were holes filled with sharpened bamboo that would be covered with branches and leaves. When a soldier stood on the trap, the spikes would impale him, and worse, the spikes might have been daubed with poison or feces. The soldier would then scream out, but he wouldn't die. This was the point, because the Viet Cong wanted more men to go down into the tunnel. Not only were there often more traps down there, but even if there weren't, pulling an injured man off sharp sticks and dragging him out through the tunnel was very time-consuming. The Viet Cong would later say that the Americans spent so much time and energy rescuing their injured comrades that they had lots of time to regroup and plan what they were going to do next. The sheer horror of these traps were also very bad for morale. This is what Ho Chi Minh was referring to when he said the Americans would not be victorious. He was right too. There were other kinds of traps. A tunnel rat might have hit a tripwire while crawling, and then the tunnel would have collapsed on him. There's a story of a tunnel rat that popped his head out of one entrance and that triggered a spear that went through his neck. At other times, the Viet Cong made traps like something you might have seen in an Indiana Jones movie. A man could hit a tripwire in a tunnel, and then a concrete ball studded with spikes would come flying at him. A lieutenant named Jack Flowers said he experienced a totally different kind of trap. His comrade went into a tunnel, and that man triggered a tripwire. After that, a box full of scorpions rained down on him. Snakes were also used. Sometimes the Viet Cong would place them in bamboo and tie them to the roof of the tunnel. When a soldier hit the bamboo, the snake would pop out and bite the man in his face. They scared the hell out of the soldiers, some of whom called them three-step snakes, because after you were bitten, you only had 3 steps before you died. That might be a bit of an exaggeration, but you can imagine being stuck in a dark tunnel with scorpions and snakes. Flowers went into over 100 tunnels. He later said this about the expeditions: "In these tunnels, your adrenaline was pumping like a river. I swear I could hear my heart beating. You'd feel your way along for booby traps. It got so you could sense them. Same for the VC. You could smell another human being in the tunnel. You knew he was waiting for you in the dark." All these horrors that the Viet Cong created instilled so much fear in the men that volunteering to be a tunnel rat wasn't exactly on every soldier's mind. But someone had to do it. They had to do it for the team, so to speak. This is what one American said about hiding in tunnels: "We often wondered how things happened in the night, and we never saw what was going on. Guys getting their throats cut. Nobody ever knew where these guys were coming from. They had to go down every tunnel they could find, otherwise strange things happened during the night. It created tremendous psychological stress not knowing where the enemy was, so sending down tunnel rats was some peace of mind." There were successful tunnel campaigns, such as Operation Crimp and Operation Cedar Falls, but in the end, the Viet Cong proved to be more resilient. While the American soldiers were literally having nervous breakdowns going into the tunnels, the Vietnamese soldiers were at home in them. If the tunnels were destroyed, they just built more of them. The Americans had the task of Sisyphus, pushing the giant rock up a slope for eternity. As for the fate of the tunnel rats, there isn't any data on how many of them died, but it's thought that most of them succumbed during those horrific explorations of the Vietnamese subterrane. Out of 100 or so tunnel rats in the American Army, only 12 of them lived to tell the tale of those tunnels back on American soil. One of those men was Jack Flowers. He later said, "Why did we do it? I wasn't a tough guy. Nobody who knows me would ever suspect I could do what the tunnel rats did. I'd never want a son of mine to have to do it. Thank God," he said, "that these days men don't have to do what he did." It doesn't get any easier attending the funeral of someone you love. This was the funeral of my wife, one of many wives. I'm telling you this because she is one of my fondest memories. Where humans are concerned, love is the only law, and that's coming from a man who has literally seen everything. She was a healthy 146 when she died. Yeah, science never came up with a solution for falling off a cliff. A man next to me utters the usual refrain: "She was a fine woman. My thoughts and prayers are with you." Humanity went through many changes, but in terms of death speech, we were always predictable, right up until the last human took his final breath. The year of my wife's funeral, I was technically 387 years old, which made me a baby in relative terms. Those days, they only used aquamation, dissolving bodies in water. Basic stuff, it would turn out. The universe would disappear one day, and I'll be there. but I guess you want to know how it got to that point. I was born on January 1st, 2000. I have no idea who my parents were, since the story I've been told is that I was found by 3 hikers on a hilltop wrapped in a blanket of fur that was slightly lit by the North Star. I went into foster care, but around the age of 18, I told my foster parents I wanted to travel the world. I got to the age of around 35, and I think that's about the time I stopped aging. When I hit 45, people would say to me, "Ooh, you look so good for your age." When I hit 55, things got really weird. I had to start telling everyone I was taking supplements, and in the end, I just left the country, not wanting to become a scientific research project. The good thing was that I was almost constantly on the move and seemed to be good at everything I did. My first life was easy. I had a natural aptitude for everything. And when I say natural, I mean I could do anything I wanted. Back when humanity was still here and in its early stages, I was a doctor, a professional rugby player in New Zealand, a Martian virologist, a British biologist who spent most of his time studying fleas, a very successful autonomous flying vehicle salesman, and a fairground puppeteer in New Hampshire. Oh, and I can't mention all the jobs. There were lots of them before work became almost obsolete. I had as much money as I needed, when we still used money, of course, although it was sometimes difficult keeping my identity hidden when banking the stuff, when we still had banks. Banks, we would later say, were from the second dark age. You're probably wondering how I managed to not have an accident and maybe get all chewed up. Well, back before we started eating only lab-made artificial meat, I fell into an industrial meat grinder. I'll take that as my best death ever. I loved that job too. Being an expert in every lifetime gets boring after a while, so I was sausage meat. Don't ask me how it happens, but after every death I would just wake up in some place in this same body. One body could die, but another would appear. I'd look in the mirror and I was the same man. I had a soul, and it seemed I was immortal. I kind of liked the days when accidents were common. It made life more fun. But once humans stopped working and using machines to do all the work, people didn't have many accidents. But like I said, one of my wives fell off a cliff. May she rest in peace. She was the only one I stayed with until the end, because I told her my secret. The rest I left after a few years. That wasn't always easy, I can tell you. Okay, so let me take you through the first chapter of my life, the short period of about 500 years. It'll have to be an abridged version, because I'm pretty sure you don't need to know about all my personal romances, achievements, and so on. This story is about you guys, not about me. And all I'll say is after 100 or so funerals, it doesn't get any easier. Love is infinite, and listen to me when I tell you, it is the greatest thing in the universe. You guys actually figured that out for a while after the Great Machine Occupation and ensuing war, when you finally did away with class oppression. Hundreds of years before the war, you guys got pretty good at creating artificial intelligence, and this meant a lot of you had no jobs to do. But the problem was, this created inequality like the world had never seen. And this started around the 2050s. Before you start thinking that we could replicate human brains in robots that were just like us, stop, because we never could. There is something in all of you that cannot be replicated. It was the great mystery for science of all ilk, and that was what is consciousness. What makes you you? It's your soul, and when you die, it doesn't mean that you get to become a ghost and start moving around household objects just to scare American families to death. It just means you're a presence. You've been left behind. Kind of an after effect, but something that now has no thoughts of its own. You become part of everything. Just as that Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza said when he wasn't grinding those lenses of his, you have a soul and we are all connected. That's why, my friends, that love is the law. Don't you ever forget it. Anyway, enough with the lecturing. So in the early 3rd millennium, we started using some world-changing technologies. We used these to create robots that did most of the work for us. They were not at first that intelligent, so no, they did not sit down with you and chat about your ongoing agony regarding your sense of futility. They were like Alexa, but with better answers. They did all the hard work, and partly because of this, we had less to do. At first, there was this great divide, when anyone who owned these technologies grew incredibly rich. But then there was the Great Revolt, and incredibly rich people soon understood that it was no good being rich when you were dead. We soon genetically engineered most of our food, and we put an end to environmental degradation. The world flourished for a while, and we called this the Second Renaissance. We still had cattle, but things like cows became almost ornamental. We actually had a pet cow, and she was lovely. My girlfriend wanted to call her Daisy, but we decided on Ermintrude. We could even make genetically engineered milk. Humans from 2250 looked back at humans in 2020 as toy total savages. Those barbarians, they said, were cruel, nasty, they were imbeciles. We had colonized Mars by this time, but as exciting as that might sound to you, people didn't much like living in spaces from which they could not move out of unless they wore a pressurized spacesuit. Life on Mars was a bit of a chore. Even Elon Musk would have admitted it was a bit dull up there if he'd lived to see it. At first, Mars was more like a gimmicky thing. I think it was about in 2880 or something that we finally terraformed the planet. That means creating an inhabitable atmosphere there. Still, I always preferred Earth. I remember a guy once joking with me when we were on Mars. This was after we'd terraformed the place, and I said to him, "It's a bit of an anticlimax," and he laughed and replied, "Yeah, the grass is always greener." You'd only get that if you'd been on Mars, because while we did learn how to grow grass on the red planet, it was never like the luscious green grass of Earth. His joke was what you'd call a double entendre. Okay, so after the Great Divide came the Great Awakening, and that's when humans started sharing everything. We had no need to work, really, and the work we did was more in line with helping people and creating things. There was hardly any crime, and we viewed the justice system of your time like you now view medieval torture. The problem was those machines we'd created had become super intelligent, and that didn't mean that they could fall in love and tell us how great they thought the movie Blade Runner was, but it meant that they could solve problems that we couldn't. And by the way, we didn't actually watch movies in those days. We were movies. Virtual reality was as real as life, and you could choose your story. Anyway, as I said, this was great at the start. Machines didn't just do all the heavy lifting, but they devised ways to make everything sustainable. The thing was, some idiot asked a machine how to end depression, loneliness, anxiety, sorrow, and all the human emotions we didn't much like. The emotions that made us, us. The machine's answer to that was a contradiction because for those emotions not to exist, we couldn't exist. The simple solution to the problem was to terminate us. This wasn't out of animosity. Like I said, robots didn't have feelings. Our brains are way too complex. They wanted to terminate us because we had asked the machines to solve a problem. It wasn't personal. Some of those machines were weapons. While wars were a thing of the past, we used powerful destructive devices for things like drilling and creating cities in places that were once uninhabited. And we also stockpiled weapons in case of an extraterrestrial invasion. You've also got to understand that simple robots were household appliances. I had a robot dog that doubled as a lawnmower and a leaf blower. It's a long story, and I have a long way to go, but I'll tell you that before we won the war, lots of human lives were lost. The superintelligence was interconnected, so before you could say, oops, the machines turned on us. A friend of mine was killed by his own fridge. In the end, we created another superintelligence whose sole purpose was to defend humanity. Then we had something called the Machine Wars, while we hid out in the underworld, something that we'd created about a century earlier. The underworld was devised in case of natural catastrophes, such as asteroid hits or supervolcanoes going off. As you'll find out, we didn't do a very good job. So the good machines won, and we never made the mistake again of asking silly questions. Human emotions weren't something you can fix. We are what we are, even though a few wacky transhumanist neuroscientists did try playing around with our brains a bit. All machines were made from then on with a default mode that insisted that they must self-destruct if they asked to answer any question that could endanger a human life. And let me tell you, it took about another 100 years to get that right. As an example, a guy I knew asked his robot if getting married was a good idea, and the robot just blew up right in front of him. After analyzing the guy's and his girlfriend's trove of personal data and taking into the possibility of divorce, this was a dangerous question. I should have told you that sometime in the 4th century of the 3rd millennia, we had started living a lot longer and living healthier lives. This was mostly down to nanotechnology called cell manipulation. The thing was, we never got past around the age of 160. We just couldn't figure that out. But after time, we realized it was the mind-soul thing again. The mind can have enough. It turned out that around the age of 160, we just gave up. And maybe that's the way it was meant to be. And yes, there is a mind-soul duality, a spirit if you like. I'm living proof. To be honest with you, living forever isn't all it's cracked up to be. There's a beauty in death because it makes you appreciate life. I had a bout of chronic depression that lasted around 300 years because of that. I lost all purpose for a while. I begged for death. I prayed for death. Death was love to me. Without death, I lost the will to live. Anyway, I won't bore you with my psychological problems. We're gonna move on now to something big. Around 3500, the Earth's magnetic poles reversed, or should I say they'd been reversing, but something just happened fast. The fallout from that was more cosmic rays hitting us, and that meant more radiation. We had to hide underground for a while, and some people took off to Mars. Eventually, we developed a way to deflect the cosmic rays, but we lost a lot of humans to radiation-related sickness. The underground couldn't sustain us for long. A catastrophic event for you guys happened around 5,000 years later, and that was a supervolcanic eruption. This was so huge that the volcanic ash blocked out the sun and covered a large part of the planet. This killed many people and animals and destroyed much of what we'd built. Water supplies were contaminated and much of our electronic infrastructure that we relied on was destroyed. It made a huge mess of the natural environment too. This event cooled the planet and the atmosphere was filled with toxic gases. Suffice to say, it was a bit of a torrid time for you guys, but much worse was to come. It was called the greatest catastrophe since the dawn of civilization. But of course you didn't say it like that because the language you spoke didn't sound much like the one I'm talking to you in. Language evolved. Do you understand this? Ik bidde themale salis te spreken? I'm guessing you don't because it's Old English. It meant please speak more slowly. Anyway, after the eruption, the population almost halved. Since many people grew sick or died from lack of food and water, or couldn't live in colder climates, this created a mass migration. With so much infrastructure down and so much panic, the era of the Great Peace was over. Many of you got all savagey again. Population decline made sure that getting started again wasn't easy, but I won't bore you with the building details because soon you're about to all become extinct. You'd survived world wars, you'd survived machine wars, you just about got over a supervolcanic eruption, but in the year 13,462 you had a period of global warming. The Wilkes Basin ice melted and the consequence of that was that sea levels rose 3 or 4 meters. The sun getting hotter was no fault of yours. The fiery thing just turned up the heat. Cities near the coastline disappeared and there was more migration. The eruption took much of the human population with it and the floods took a lot of what was left. The population was reduced again and instead of living in large communities connected globally, you started separating yourself from others and surviving in small communities. It was a bit like the old hunter-gatherer days, although strands of civilization existed. The Earth had taken such a beating over these years that the magnificent technological infrastructure that you had built almost completely disappeared. Your peaceful ways were abandoned, and like brutes from the past, gangs of men would raid communities. The population problem was real, and even women were stolen so they could procreate for various communities. You lived like this for thousands of years, slowly rebuilding what you had built before. Communities again collaborated, but much of what had been destroyed was not salvageable. You simply could not emerge as a technological species because the Earth's population had been reduced so much and you lost so much infrastructure. You did at least have books and artifacts from the past, but these were not understandable by the majority of people. Those on Mars fared better at first, but due to the heating up of the sun, that planet became almost uninhabitable. Because the terraformed environment there was so much less diverse, the Martian colony became extinct first. The final blow-up, the coup de grace, came with an impact from a large asteroid in the year 22,569. The impact created giant tsunamis and the Earth burned. It threw so much moisture and dust in the air that the sunlight was blocked. Some of you died quickly and others died slowly. I wept as I saw my 2 friends starve to death, both of them wondering why I wasn't worried at all. I wanted to die, but I had a long way to go. I wandered around that barren planet alone for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. You could say this was quite a boring era in my long life. I kept dying and reappearing. I was surely cursed to see this whole thing through to the end. Life forms still existed, but most were small animals. Snails became my best friends. I would hold them in my hand and talk to them. The first was named Brian, then came Brian 2, and so on. I married Brian 3 out of sheer boredom. I must move on because you need to know how it all ends. Hundreds of thousands of years was nothing in the great scheme of things. For millions of years, I waited for something to happen, for evolution to kickstart and you guys to slowly come back, for something to crawl out of the swamp, for anything to happen. After a billion years, things got so hot that the ocean started to evaporate. After almost 3 billion years, all life forms were extinct except for me. My body no longer existed in its physical form because of the severe heat, but my mind carried on. I really was a ghost. Billions more years passed and the sun started burning hydrogen in a shell around its core, becoming a big red giant. Oceans of lava floated on the surface before the Earth itself was engulfed by the sun. I became mere consciousness in the universe. universe, like a god able to witness the unraveling of the enterprise that started with a big bang. After 120 trillion years, and man, I was getting bored by then, there were only about 100 stars left in the Milky Way. The missing ones had literally run out of energy. I was still there, in space, just thinking, come on, just let this damn place end. I longed for the days I could fall into a meat grinder or tell jokes on Mars. Life was beautiful and I missed it dearly. Finally, after hundreds of quadrillions of years, the whole place was empty, like a football stadium during one of your many pandemics. The universe was a vacuum and we had entered a dark era. But what was nothing? What exactly was nothing? Subatomic particles were still there. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I knew that those particles were busy trying to break down a barrier. I just felt it. They joined forces and strained together, propagating. I was witnessing a birth. Uh-oh, I thought, here we go again. And I realized I was observing another Big Bang. The whole thing was starting again. I was seeing the eternal recurrence, a cycle both violent and beautiful. The universe started kicking and screaming like the thousands of newborn babies I'd fathered when humans existed. And that's what I'm watching right now. I've got a long time to wait until I see the next generation of you guys, but I'm at peace. In this cosmic arena, there is more than just matter. There is me, an eternal soul, a timeless monument to the spirit, an enduring love and light that I can't explain and don't want to explain. So I'll see you guys in the next life a few billion years from now. Don't forget to be nice to each other next time. Life is precious. That's what you'll learn when you live forever. It's an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at an ordinary office building. Grace, an intern, gets on the elevator in the garage. She's bound for the CEO's office on the 10th floor. Just as the doors close, Rob, a junior sales agent, hops in. Previously, Grace had been a victim of one of Rob's little pranks, pressing all the buttons right before he gets off on the first floor. This made the elevator stop on every floor and caused Grace to be lectured for returning from break a few minutes late. Today, she's ready. First floor, the elevator doors open. Rob steps out and turns back to run his hand down the button panel. In a move worthy of a ninja, Grace maneuvers around him and lightly shoves his shoulder. Surprised, Rob stumbles back into the elevator. Grace tosses him a smug grin as the doors close. Sure, she has to wait for another elevator, but it's worth it. Annoyed, Rob repeatedly mashes the door open button, and the lights in the elevator flicker and it pauses for almost an imperceptible second before it continues to rise. Rob doesn't know it yet, but he's just no-clipped out of reality. The elevator beeps for the second floor. The doors open. Rob leaps out. He looks around in sudden confusion. On either side of him are long hallways. In front of him is a large empty office space. He can't remember what color the walls in his office are, but he's sure that they weren't a dingy sunshine yellow. He turns around to go back into the elevator, but the wall behind him is solid. No elevator. Disbelieving, Rob feels the wall. It's cold, almost damp, but smooth with no cracks. Rob doesn't know how they did it, but he's sure it's a joke. He turns back to the empty office and walks forward. "You got me, guys," he says, fully expecting a bunch of coworkers to pop out with their cell phones, recording their amazing prank. His voice echoes slightly in the vastness of the empty space. There's no answer. The room is still except for the loud hum of the fluorescent lights. It smells quite unpleasantly of old paper, stale coffee, and mildew. The annoying buzz from the lights is making Rob's head throb. If it keeps up, he'll have a migraine. He takes out his cell phone. His fingers are slippery with perspiration as he texts. The message icon just spins. It can't send his message. Rob tries calling, but the line is dead. His phone doesn't have any bars. He walks all over the office space holding his phone up, trying to see if he can get better reception. Squish! His expensive leather loafer sinks into the soggy tan carpet in the right corner of the room. In fact, the patch of carpet so wet, tiny toadstools are sprouting. A sudden odd grunting, growling noise makes Rob spin around. A chill skitters down his spine. Across the room is something. It looks like a human crawling on its hands and feet, but the elbow and knee joints are bent the other way. Its face is surrounded by shaggy, matted dark hair. The creature tilts its head up and sniffs the air before making a grunting growl again. At first, Rob is frozen, but he gets a hold of himself. Hugging the wall at his back, he begins to sidestep toward the entrance in the next room. The creature hangs back. It seems to be intimidated by the eye contact. Its cold black eyes stare back at Rob. It has a weird, aggressive smile on its face, but it's not coming closer. Rob's almost to the entrance when disaster strikes. The moist mildew smell wafting from the carpet makes him sneeze. He breaks eye contact. The creature growls and charges toward him. It has a strange, quick gait. Rob turns and runs. The next room is the same, overly cheerful yet dingy yellow walls, moist tan carpet, and buzzy, glaring fluorescent lights. Rob dashes across the room, the creature's gaining on him. The room ends in a T-shaped hallway. Rob zags right, he slips, barely managing to stay on his feet. His loafers weren't made for running on moist carpet. Rob runs down the hallway, passing several rooms. They're all the same, yellow and tan. There's a loud growl behind him. Rob looks back. The creature has been joined by a second beast. They're gaining on Rob. They can't be more than 20 feet away. Their toothy grins are terrifying. Up ahead, the hallway dead ends. Rob barely has time to turn around before they attack. He kicks one in the face. Its head snaps back and it whimpers. The other creature claws at Rob's chest. He pushes it away and kicks it too. The creature gloms onto his shoe, sinking its teeth into the leather and yanking it free. It chews on its prize while the other creature growls at Rob menacingly. But it doesn't come any closer as Rob stares at it. Without breaking eye contact, Rob reaches down, takes off his other shoe, and tosses it. The creature springs after it. Rob manages to sidle past the first creature who's engrossed in ripping apart Rob's hand-stitched loafer. He ducks into a room. Once out of the sight of the creatures, he runs on socked feet through the room, and then another and another. Several rooms later, Rob collapses in a heap on the floor, his heart's galloping a mile a minute. What were those things? Where is he? The room he's in is the same as all the others except for one difference. In a corner is a 5-drawer file cabinet. Once Rob catches his breath, he wanders over and tries opening each of the drawers. Sadly, they're all locked. Rob walks into another room. He feels gross. He has wet patches on his slacks from where he sat down. His socks are clammy. His cell phone is missing. He lost it while escaping the creatures. He doesn't know what to do, so he keeps walking. He goes into the next room, and the next. It's a veritable maze of yellow offices with tan carpets. Suddenly, he hears something. The sound is faint, but somehow familiar. Rob strains to hear, but the sound stops. He walks in the direction he thinks the sound's coming from. 2 rooms later, he hears it again. It's a telephone. It's ringing. The ringing is echoing. The ringing phone means communication. It means other people. Perhaps it even means a way out of here, wherever this place is. But first, Rob has to find the phone. Rob takes off his socks. He'd rather walk barefoot on the gross carpet. Moist socks freak him out. He also takes off his belt. He wants to be prepared in case those horrible creatures show up again. The next room, of course, is the same as all the others, but it has a lone desk. The desk drawers are not locked. One has paper clips, several ballpoint pens, and a highlighter. Rob tries writing on the wall, but the chartreuse highlighter can't be seen against the yellow. The other drawer is empty except for a crumpled, half-full bag of stale tortilla chips. Rob suddenly realizes that he's not hungry or tired. In fact, he's lost all sense of time. He looks at his watch. It stopped. How long ago, it's hard to say. Rob walks on. Sometimes the rooms have an item or two, but most times they don't. As he walks, he has conversations in his head with his co-workers, the kind of chat one has when they find themselves in the break room waiting for their coffee to brew. How about those Dodgers last night? You're gonna surprise the wife with a 20th anniversary trip to Tahiti? That sounds amazing. Sucks that little Caitlin needs braces. Our dental plan isn't that great. Rob also talks to Grace in his head. Sorry about the elevator. I was just blowing off some steam. You're pretty. I wish I knew how to talk to you instead of resorting to juvenile pranks to get your attention. He wonders what magic Grace did to transport him to this desolate yellow hellscape. Rob can hear the phone ringing loud and clear now, although it's still hard to know exactly where it's coming from. He sees the creatures a few more times. He stares them down and cracks his belt at them. They reluctantly slink away. He also sees a lady in a power suit with a shell-shocked expression, but she scurries away before he can say anything to her. Then almost unexpectedly, he steps into a room just like all the others, except there's a black business phone on a desk in the center of the room. Rob sits down to wait. It's not long before the phone rings. His hand trembling, Rob picks it up. Hello? He's surprised to find that his voice is rusty from disuse. He clears his throat and tries again. Hello? The line is buzzy, the connection not the greatest. It takes a moment for Rob to process what the woman on the phone is yelling about. It's been a long time since anyone has spoken to him. The technician was supposed to come to her house between 9 and 4, and it's now 4:17, and no one has showed up. And what is he going to do about it? Rob sets the phone down. He gets under the desk and lays there in the fetal position. He doesn't care that his button-up shirt is getting wet. The back rooms. Depending on whom you ask, there are over 100 levels of back rooms, each simply waiting for some poor, unsuspecting soul to somehow glitch out of reality and get stuck in a horrific maze. Some levels have horrible humanoid monsters. Some levels are gaily decorated with balloons and bunting that says happy birthday. Of course, were you to show up for a birthday party in the back rooms, chances are you would not survive the killer clowns. Some purists insist there's only 3 levels to the back rooms. I'm inclined to believe that only a single level exists. When the image of an empty office with cheap tan, stain-resistant carpet, fluorescent lighting, and yellow walls was posted in a paranormal forum, it resonated with so many because it spoke of our existential nightmares. It's a metaphor for the horrors of modern life, that for many of us our job is meaningless, unfulfilling, and rife with endless bureaucracy. The ultimate horror isn't a werewolf who wants to use your left shin bone as a chew toy, or a vampire that wants to drain you of your blood, or any other made-up horror, but a soul-sucking job. But what do I know? I'm just an overworked, caffeinated, underpaid writer sitting in a drab cubicle with nothing except for my laptop, surrounded by other overworked, caffeinated, underpaid writers sitting in their drab cubicles, each of us maniacally typing away, striving to meet deadlines. If there is one person the U.S. authorities do not want escaping from prison, it's the notorious Mexican drug kingpin, one Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. This man, from meager beginnings, the son of a farming family from Sinaloa, became an enemy number one of the United States, and a very rich man too. They have him locked up now, but El Chapo has escaped from prison before. Not once, but twice. So it goes without saying that right now he is guarded like no one else on the planet. Could this criminal Houdini get out again? Let's have a look. First, let's see how he managed to escape from prison the first time. In 1993, the LA Times ran the headline, "Mexico arrests reputed top drug kingpin." He was arrested in Guatemala, not far from the Mexican border. The charges against him were murder, kidnapping, and of course, drug trafficking. The authorities said he was behind a huge trafficking operation in a massive tunnel that ran from Tijuana to San Diego, where drugs were carried through. Digging tunnels, as you'll see, was something of a forte for Guzman and his crew. He was extradited to Mexico and got 20 years 9 months to be served in a maximum security prison. There, it said he controlled the place and lived in comfort, with the guards doing what he told them to do. While he could easily run his operations from there, as time went by, he feared extradition to the US. It was time to go. It was January 19, 2001 when he made the first escape. A prison guard named Francisco El Chito Cambreros Rivera opened the electronic door to his cell when Guzman hid himself in a laundry basket. He was pushed through a series of doors and eventually got out of the main door. From there, he was taken in the trunk of a car to a designated spot, and when the time was right, he took off into the night. Like that, he was gone. It might sound too easy, but it was found out that he not only had guards on his payroll, but also the prison director. Even the cops were paid to make his getaway into the night that much easier. It turned out to be a bit of an embarrassment for the Mexican authorities. All the bribes Guzman paid added up to around $2.5 million. So this could never happen again, right? Wrong. He kept on doing what he did and became Mexico's most wanted man. But despite that, he managed to evade capture. Then on the 22nd of February 2014, after an operation between Mexican and US authorities, he was captured again. They had him, and they thought that was it. He was not going to bribe his way out of prison this time. When being moved around, he was surrounded by the military and the police. Even the A-team couldn't have made the plan come together to extricate this guy from the arms of the law. This time, he was locked up in a very restricted area. His cell had no windows and he had little contact with anyone. He had a Spartan cell, and this time no luxuries. A bed, a shelf, a shower, a toilet bowl, and a basin. That's what he got. He was allowed some visits and he had the right to receive the maximum amount of money to buy hygiene products. That was about $48 US. Not so much for the man who had millions. He could take an hour out of his cell a day, but the guards were told not to communicate with him. How on earth could he escape a second time then? Well, on the 11th of July 2015, he did just that. You see, there was a blind spot for the security cameras, and that was where the shower was. At close to 9 p.m. that night, he was seen going to that part of the cell, and that's where he vanished. Prior to that, for months, El Chapo's men had been digging a tunnel, and the end point was at that shower cell. The digging had been so noisy at times, some of the other inmates had complained about strange noises. El Chapo's wife, Emma Coronel, played a big part in orchestrating the escape. El Chapo had landed not far from the prison where the digging began, and he had even managed to get a smartwatch smuggled into his cell so the diggers knew the coordinates. This was some escape, and the tunnel even had ventilation and lighting. To get out fast, El Chapo used a motorbike, but it was especially made to run on rails. This contraption was also used for the excavation process. Authorities later said the tunnel was 0.93 miles long, 5 feet 7 inches high, and 30 inches in width. It was 33 feet underground, and so El Chapo used a ladder to get down there. He was a free man, but his freedom didn't last very long. After an armed raid at a residence on the 8th of January 2016, Guzman managed to get away, once again using tunnels. He was captured shortly after though. Now, the USA wanted him again, and the proceedings got in the way to extradite him. Guzman's men tried anything to prevent this from happening, and even assassinated a federal judge. It didn't work. He was finally extradited on January 9, 2017 to the USA, exactly 18 years after this first prison escape. Right after his sentencing, in which he received life in prison plus 30 years, he just disappeared. That's because on his way to prison, the safest bet was to take him to an undisclosed location. Even Guzman's lawyers didn't know where he was. It was later revealed that he ended up at what's called America's highest security prison. That is the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado. It's known in short as ADX Florence. This is where the worst of the worst go. In prison terms, it's the end of the road. There are way more guards here to the number of inmates than at other prisons. Inmates are locked up 23 hours a day. When they are allowed out, it may come at any time, day or night. So even if somehow a plan could be devised by the people on the outside, they wouldn't know when their guy was out of his cell. The 7 by 12 feet cell has a bed, a stool, and a desk all made of poured concrete. The cells are soundproofed so prisoners can't shout and communicate with each other. The inmates never know where they are in the facility because they never see through a window that will allow them to guess their location. Even when they can exercise, it is not a yard, but an empty swimming pool, so they can't see over the walls. It's not a big one either, and it only takes 10 steps to walk from end to end. All over the prison there are motion detectors and cameras, and the thick steel doors can only be opened with remote control. Officers monitor all parts of the prison from a control room, and if anything strange should happen, they can hit a panic button which will automatically lock every door in the prison. The prison also has pressure pads, so an alert is sent if someone should stand on one of those pads. If someone could somehow get past the pressure pads and the cameras and get outside, they would have to scale a 12-foot tall razor wire fence, and they'd have to do that in front of heavily armed guards in one of the many towers. Other guards will walk around with attack dogs. It's very likely that Guzman is also in the most secure unit of this ultra-secure prison, which is called Range 13. By the way, guards at this prison are vetted to prevent anyone corrupt getting a job. While working, they're told to communicate with the prisoners as little as possible. It's escape-proof is what most people say, and it's not a nice place to end up. A former warden once described it like this: "This supermax is life after death. It's long-term. In my opinion, it's far much worse than death." Others have said how eerily quiet the place is because no two inmates move at the same time. It's very clean. Everything is spotless. So when journalists have gone in, they've been very surprised. It might look as bright as heaven if it weren't hell. In fact, that's how one warden described it, like a clean version of hell. He told 60 Minutes, "I don't know what hell is, but I do know the assumption would be for a free person, it's pretty close to it." This is how one inmate described it. "The purpose is to gradually tear a person down mentally and physically through environmental and physical deprivation. For an inmate, it's kind of like having the place to yourself." Some people have said, because it's like this, the only way a person could escape would be if they actually had the prison warden in their pocket, which is never going to happen. There are only around 400 inmates, some of whom include Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and Terry Nichols, the Oklahoma City bomber. Just to get near the place, you'd be spotted, and Guzman can forget about buying land near it. This prison is in a remote location. There's not much for miles around. Guzman has visitors, but only his lawyer and his 2 daughters have been allowed to see him. He cannot actually touch anyone who visits him. He's told his lawyer because of the oppressive conditions, he regularly throws up, has headaches, and also sinus trouble. He said it's also very hard to sleep because the lights are on all the time. If prisoners do want to break from the monotony, they at least have a TV, but that only plays religious and educational programs. This is how another person who's retired from the prison described this place. Supermax is austere, and it's run with absolute structure and security in mind. From an operational perspective, it's the most secure prison on Earth. But if the man known as Papillon escaped from the notorious Devil's Island penal colony, and if those 3 guys really did escape from Alcatraz, maybe no prison on Earth is 100% secure. Just about anyone in the corrections business would disagree, but maybe El Chapo could get out of this one. What are the chances of Mr. Guzman escaping from the place nicknamed the Alcatraz of the Rockies? Let's think about it. If he were to get out of his cell, maybe he'd have to do that by bribing a guard. But they've been vetted. Perhaps the only way a guard would offer him help would be because Guzman's men had kidnapped his family. But as only one man moves at a time, that prisoner is being watched from the control room. We just don't think he could go out the front door. He certainly couldn't get past those pressure pads and the guards in the towers. and the guards with the dogs, and over a massive fence that would cut him to pieces. All the time, everything is caught on CCTV. He would need a small army on the outside, and since the location is in the middle of nowhere, that army would be seen. Even if he employed some great hacker to hack the prison system and open the doors, he'd still have to face heavily armed guards. We can't see this happening outside of a Hollywood movie. But prisoners do have rights to see medical professionals, never mind how secure they are. This is the US law, so perhaps an escape could be made if El Chapo had to make a trip to a hospital. Possibly a catastrophic event, such as an earthquake or a fire, could result in an escape. But this is pretty unlikely. If prisoners were suddenly removed from their cells, they'd be shackled, so they wouldn't get anywhere fast. In conclusion, we think El Chapo will not be going anywhere. This prison is a techno-fortress that no man could escape from. The only scenario that he gets out in is a screenplay which involves an apocalyptic event shutting down all the systems and the guards being eaten by monsters, after which El Chapo sneaks out the back door and begins a mission of survival. He'll be doing no digging out of prison this time, and no one will be holding out their hand and accepting a bribe. It's one of those nights where you just can't seem to enter that final stage of sleep where deep sleep embraces you. You turn over and over, drifting in and out of consciousness, having strange, nightmarish thoughts during your micro-sleeps. The day was oppressively hot and humid, so you left the window cracked to get a breeze, and now the curtains seem to expand and contract, like lungs filling with air. It's kind of relaxing to watch. Until you see something. Were those eyes peeping through the curtains? Your heart begins to race. Is this the creep you'd heard rumors about? The deranged serial killer known as Jeff the Killer that's still on the loose? No, you must have been dreaming. You rub your eyes and take another look. Squinting through the dark, you see a ghoulish, monstrous face looking straight at you as he slowly pulls himself through your opened window. In the morning, your bed will be empty. In the weeks to come, you'll be just another statistic, another missing kid, one of thousands of young folks that go missing in the USA each year. In time, your family will give up hope of ever seeing you again. You become one of the 115 children that year whose disappearance has been officially recorded as stranger abduction. It's true that every year scores of young people just vanish into thin air. Sometimes they go out and don't come home. Sometimes they're at the shopping mall with their parents and just disappear, never to be seen again. Sometimes they're snatched from their beds during the night. There are real-life boogeymen out there, maniacs on the loose, skulking around quiet neighborhoods. So, who is Jeff the Killer? Is he responsible for those unexplained abductions? Is he even real? Moving to a new place in your teens isn't much fun at all. You make friends, and then you have to abandon them. But for Jeff and his brother Lou, the move wasn't so difficult to accept. The new house was fancy, to say the least, and the neighborhood didn't look too bad either. No sooner than Jeff, Lou, and their parents got their new house in order, the nosy neighbors came around to say hello and check out who they'd be loving or hating in the next year or so. To break the ice, one of the neighbors invited the family to a birthday party. The neighbor Barbara explained that her son Billy was about to have a birthday party. Jeff's mom Margaret said her husband Peter as well as the kids would love to go. At this point, Jeff and Lou were in the background listening, both of them feeling kind of peeved that their parents had agreed on their behalf to go to the party of some kid they didn't even know. Young Jeff had always had a problem with authority, and he was quick to tell his mom that she shouldn't do stuff like that. He stormed off in a huff, retreating to his bedroom where he threw himself down on his bed and skulked. In that moment of teenage angst, he felt something really strange inside him, like his very own pair of anguish, an acute pain in his stomach. He felt hypnotized by his own anger. How dare she do that, he thought. He then came out of his enraged trance, not really knowing what had come over him. The same thing happened again the next morning as he was hastily eating a bowl of multigrain peanut butter Cheerios. There was something in his stomach, this time a grinding pain, and there was that feeling of rage again. He didn't know if he liked it or not. Maybe it was just moving stress, anxiety about going to a new school, meeting new kids. Some of them were bound to be jerks, that was for sure. He realized he was gripping his spoon so hard his knuckles were white. He was trembling with anger. But Jeff's anxieties were justified that morning at the school bus stop. Some wise-ass kid did an ollie on his skateboard right over Jeff and Lou's legs. Had he messed that up, he could have snapped one of their legs like a twig. Jeff didn't know it then, but this was the beginning of an end. The skateboarder was soon joined by two other kids, and in true Stephen King fashion, there was one cool kid, the skateboarder, whose name was Randy, a nerdy-looking kid named Keith, and an obese kid whose name was Troy. These kids would become Jeff's mortal enemies, his bêtes noires. In literal French, that means black beasts. "Well, look what's been dragged into the neighborhood," said Randy. "A couple of new freaks to kick around for a while." The fat kid guffawed, and the skinny-looking nerdy kid just stood there motionless. Randy explained to Jeff and Lou that as new kids on the block, There was a tax to pay, calling it a bus fare, and intimidatingly, he got right up in Lou's face. Lou stood his ground, pushing Randy back, but in a moment of outlandish anger, the fat kid whipped out a knife. Randy turned to his two bootlicker friends and said, "Well, looks like these two kids are gonna have to learn the hard way." The fat kid wielded the knife right in front of Lou's face and proceeded to rifle through Lou's pockets. He then passed a wallet to Randy. All the time, Lou was thinking how inconceivable it was for three kids in a wealthy and quiet suburban American neighborhood to mug him and his brother on their way to school. Jeff just sat there, boiling, raging, on the verge of exploding. That devilish feeling again filled his guts. He felt possessed with anger, and he finally stood up and growled at Randy. "You give that wallet back to my bro, or I'll knock the teeth right out of your friggin' head." Jeff was seething, and before Randy could respond physically or come up with a smart retort, he punched Randy square in the nose, shattering it like porcelain. Lou hadn't seen Jeff do that before, but he was even more surprised when his younger brother grabbed Randy's finger and snapped it. Jeff took Randy's knife, but soon Skinny Keith and Portly Troy were on his back. Lightweight Keith took a stabbing for the team and went down like a sack of bricks. Jeff pushed Troy off him and hit him so hard in the stomach that Troy threw up as he crawled on the floor. The scene was a massacre. Lou had never seen anything like that before from his brother. "Man, bro, what the hell's gotten into you?" The two ran to school rather than get the bus. Jeff looked behind and he could see people on the street attending to the wounded kids. Did he feel remorse that day as he sat in his class, listening to a teacher talk about verb conjugation? No, he felt the opposite. He felt alive. He felt the violence in his very marrow. He loved violence. This was a new discovery for him. Part 2. Jeff the Maniac. Jeff got home that evening and his mom asked him how school was, to which Jeff replied, "Awesome," as the sweet memory of the beating and the smell of someone else's blood filled his senses. But as things tend to go, Jeff wasn't exactly off the hook for executing what the justice system calls a serious assault, not to mention using a deadly weapon on a child. The cops turned up at Jeff's house and explained that their son's outstanding wrath had caused some serious injuries to 3 kids that lived in the neighborhood. Jeff, as stubborn as ever, explained to the cops and his distraught parents that he'd been the victim of the violence, and he had only retaliated in a comparable fashion. "Comparable?" said one of the cops. "I got 2 kids in the hospital with stab wounds, and another kid that looks like he's been kicked in the stomach by a racehorse." Jeff had to try really hard not to smile. He bit his lip. What could he do, though? The game was up. There were witnesses. There was forensic evidence. "Okay," Jeff said. "It was me, but I was only sticking up for my bro. Those guys pulled out the knife first. I just finished it." Jeff was already thinking about spending a year in what he heard was nicknamed Gladiator School when his brother Lou came rushing down the stairs. With the knife in his hands, Lou said, "It was me. Don't arrest my brother." Lou put down the knife and the cops cuffed him. All the while, Jeff was telling him that Lou was lying, that it was he who was at fault for the bus stop carnage. As his brother was taken away in the cop car, Jeff sat in the driveway weeping. What had he done? For days, Jeff stayed in his bed with the curtains closed. He couldn't go to school. He couldn't even sleep. He just lay in bed, depressed, feeling as if darkness had chosen him, abused him, manipulated him. After a few days, something unbelievable happened. His mom waltzed into his bedroom as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just lost a son to a brutal penal system, possibly for many years. She just whipped back the curtains and jovially exclaimed to Jeff, "Guess what day it is?" "What the?" thought Jeff. "Has this woman lost her mind?" "It's party day," said his mom. "You remember, before all that nonsense with the knives, we were invited to Billy's birthday bash." Jeff was rather displeased with his mom's patent lack of empathy. "Come on, Jeff," she said. "So your brother's gone for a while. Don't let that spoil an otherwise beautiful sunny day. You'll always be my beautiful son. Let's go have some fun." For some reason, Jeff didn't like being called beautiful. He noticed she'd really gone overboard with her clothes. She was dressed to impress, and this bugged him even more. When the family arrived at Barbara's house, Jeff noticed that all the adults were wearing fancy clothes. All of them. It seemed they were trying to impress each other. Some of them were noticeably drunk already, talking loudly about their many accomplishments and the wonderful, talented children they'd brought into the world. "Go on in the yard and play with the other kids," Jeff's mom said. This would prove to be foolhardy, given Jeff's track record so far with kids in the neighborhood. And then it happened, just as Jeff was starting to get along with the children. Randy, Keith, and Troy appeared, still looking a bit beaten up, but no doubt ready for another round with the new kid. Randy said, "You didn't think this was done, did ya? It ain't done by a long way." Again, Jeff was reminded of countless teenage movies he'd seen. What ensued was a one-on-one with Randy and Jeff. Jeff headbutted Randy, breaking his recently fixed nose yet another time, and blood splattered on the faces of the younger kids, sending them running around the garden in hysterics. A small kid froze, and as a teddy bear dropped from his hands, you could see a wet patch form and expand on the front of his SpongeBob shorts. Jeff got the better of Randy, but then the two goons pulled out their guns. This was unheard of in the neighborhood, and even some of the parents were now running into the distance shouting, "Someone call 911!" Jeff couldn't do anything with guns pointed at him, and before he knew it, Randy stabbed him with a knife. Troy and Keith laughed like the goons they were, and then Randy just started beating Jeff to a pulp. He dragged Jeff into the kitchen, whereupon he picked up a bottle of vodka and smashed it on Jeff's head. But Jeff didn't fight back. He took every punch, every kick. His face was dripping blood. A shard of glass was sticking out of his head. His stomach was punctured, but he didn't fight back. "Come on," said Randy. "Hit me. Fight back." Jeff just took more shots to the face, but he didn't retaliate. To try and light the fire again in Jeff, Randy shouted, "Your bro's some dude's girl right now, and that's all because of me. Fight me." Part 3. Jeff snaps. And that was it. That was the final straw. Jeff felt that rage build up inside of him again. He lurched at Randy like a rabid lion. He pushed him down and smothered him with his incredible strength. Randy was helpless. Jeff drew back his fist and punched Randy right in the heart. A shocked look appeared on Randy's face, like he'd just seen the devil himself. He took one last breath, blood bubbled from his mouth, and he died there and then. The parents there still couldn't believe what they'd witnessed. There were children that had become feral, animalistic, bestial. Keith and Troy now turned their guns on Jeff. They fired and missed. Jeff ran up the stairs past the parents, now in a state of shock, their faces whiter than the new ceramic tiles on the kitchen floor. Now out of bullets, Troy and Keith pulled knives out on Jeff, but soon Jeff had his own weapon, a towel rack. He cracked Troy's balloon-sized head with the rack, knocking him clean out. Skinny Keith realized he was probably now out of his depth, but it was too late. There was nowhere to run. They were both in the bathroom fighting, and suddenly they hit a shelf and a bottle of bleach fell on them. Inexplicably, the bleach was open and the boys were both covered in the stuff. Keith screamed as the bleach burned his face, and that's when Jeff caved Keith's wiry face in with his handy towel rack. As Keith lay on the floor, not far from death, he smiled. "Funny, huh?" said Jeff, somewhat nonplussed, even though he was no stranger to strangeness. "Look at you," mumbled Keith through bloody, broken teeth. "You've been doused in bleach and vodka." Keith's last effort to beat that new kid was to throw a cigarette lighter at Jeff. Jeff burst into flames, and screaming, he ran downstairs and through the house. He was a ball of flames, a human inferno. Parents stood back in horror. Jeff collapsed, and that's the last thing he remembered about that day. Part 4. Jeff the Killer. The next thing Jeff knew, he was lying in a hospital bed and he couldn't move. Almost his entire body was covered with bandages. Suddenly he heard, "He's awake." It was that familiar voice of his overbearing mother, but this time he was pleased she was by his side. "Jeff," she said, "Lou is out. Witnesses told the police that Randy had first produced the knife. Your brother's free. We're going home, a family again." Jeff felt a twinge of relief, but it was hard to be happy when his body was covered in 3rd, 2nd, and 1st-degree burns. He tried to smile, and then he realized that he had no lips to smile with. His mother saw her son's pain. "Good news though, Jeff. Every cloud has a silver..." She didn't finish her sentence, this time being self-aware enough not to be chirpy in a horrible situation. Sometime later, both Jeff's parents were there when his final bandage had to be pulled off. "This is gonna hurt a bit," the doctor told Jeff, as those final bandages unfurled from Jeff's face. He was taken aback by the sheer horror painted on his parents' faces. They were trying to suppress their disgust, but something hardwired into their brains wouldn't allow them to hide their terror. Jeff asked for a mirror. The doctor told him, "Just start with one part of your face and then move to another part. This might come as a shock to you, but you'll soon get used to it." Jeff didn't take that advice and instead just grabbed the mirror. For seconds, minutes, he stared at that mirror, moving his head from side to side, studying every angle. His parents were waiting for him to cry, to scream, to collapse in shock, but as Jeff kept looking at his new face, a white, leathery face, a face without eyelids, without anything resembling normal lips, it just looked as though he was happy with the results of his personal tragedy. "It's perfect," he said, "just perfect." He wasn't crying. His mother noticed he was trying to laugh. When Jeff was left alone, the doctor told his parents that their son was in shock and it wasn't unusual for someone to act that way. The reality, he said, hadn't just set in. "Just take him home," the doctor said, "and give him a lot of support." "Of course we will," said Jeff's mother, feeling ever so slightly guilty that she was glad about the fact that Jeff would be easier to control now that he was damaged goods. "Oh," said the doctor as he was walking away, "don't let him be alone for long." Later that night, while the family was sleeping, Jeff's mom was awoken by a strange sound coming from the bathroom. When she entered that bathroom, she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Jeff was carving a smile into his face with the knife. He'd also cut off what remained of his eyelids. "How do I look, Ma?" Jeff said earnestly. She couldn't even speak. She couldn't move. The woman was petrified. "What's up, Ma? Don't you think I'm beautiful anymore?" "Yeah," she said while slowly backpedaling out of the bathroom. "You are my beautiful son. You'll always be my beautiful little honeypot." She then ran for it, got Jeff's dad, and the two of them tried to wrestle the knife from Jeff's hand. "What?" Jeff screamed. "You lied to me. You don't think I'm beautiful." He was too powerful for them. The rage had returned, and it wasn't difficult to stick that knife into both of them. Jeff stood over them, their lungs drowning in their own blood. It was a beautiful sight. He was Jeff the Killer. That's what he'd always been, a killer. He had one last stop before he left the house and fulfilled his own prophecy. Jeff walked into Lou's room. Standing at the side of Lou's bed, he put his scarred, leathery hand over his brother's mouth. Lou suddenly looked at Jeff with wide open eyes as his dear brother sunk a knife deep into his stomach. "Shh," said Jeff. "Just go to sleep." Part 5. Jeff the Thriller. We weren't kidding at the start when we said that in the US, scores of young people are abducted by strangers. But did Jeff the Killer ever actually exist? We think most of you already know that this is fiction, but what really gives it away? If you go back from the start of the original Jeff the Killer story, there's always a part that says, excerpt from a local newspaper, ominous unknown killer is still at large. After weeks of unexplained murders, the ominous unknown killer is still on the rise. After little evidence has been found, a young boy states that he survived one of the killer's attacks and bravely tells his story. Okay, so first of all, the headline of that story, "Ominous Unknown Killer is Still at Large," would never be a headline in any newspaper anywhere. Trust us. We have former journalists and editors on our team of writers. The writer of Jeff the Killer seems to have found that adjective ominous and then gone and used it wherever he can. Secondly, the first paragraph is badly written. Listen to this. "There, in the little ray of light illuminating from between my curtains were a pair of two eyes. These weren't regular eyes, they were dark, ominous eyes." Ominous again. But the grammar also isn't corrected in the first sentence. As for a pair of two eyes, that's called a tautology, and no news editor on earth would allow that to go to print. So we know at the very beginning that this tale is not true. If the point was to make it sound believable, the Jeff the Killer writer messed up right at the start. As for a young boy attacking other young boys and going on a murder spree, well, there just haven't been any murder sprees of this kind since the story was first published in 2011. So what about Jeff's amazing heart-stopping strength? Well, let's just take a giant leap and say Jeff was possessed and had superhuman strength for a 13-year-old kid. So there is something called commotio cordis, which can happen to a person when they're struck in the heart region of their chest at just the right time. And yes, it can kill. You can actually find quite a few stories of when this has happened to young people, although baseballs were the killer, not punches. What about Jeff going up in flames after having a vodka bottle smashed over him and being doused with bleach? Firstly, not much vodka would have gotten on Jeff. Secondly, you couldn't set a person on fire if you splashed vodka on them. It's not flammable enough. Remember that Keith somehow threw the lighter? We're guessing it was a Zippo lighter with a wick. But even then, vodka? No way. As for the bleach, which made Keith and Jeff scream, well, bleach can irritate the skin if it's not washed off, but it wouldn't make a person scream unless, possibly, it was poured into their eyes. And another thing, bleach isn't flammable. It's just not believable at all. Jeff would now be 22 years old and still on the run after killing all those kids he didn't kill. He wouldn't be hard to spot given that he has horrific scars from burns and a smile cut into his face. It's August 11th, 1934, and along with 136 prisoners, you're on your way to what will become known as America's toughest prison. You guys are what the authorities have called the incorrigibles, because in the prisons where you've come from, you just couldn't stop causing trouble. All of you have been called violent and unpredictable, and so you're being taken to the penitentiary version of hell. You sit there on a specially designed train coach, handcuffed and surrounded by 60 FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, and other security. The atmosphere is solemn, and each of you grisly-looking hardened criminals each eye each other with distrust. Every chug of the train is foreboding. In your mind, it says to you, "You're going to hell, you're going to hell, you're going to hell." You're not wrong. That's how the first shipment of prisoners traveled to Alcatraz Island. None of those guys were prisoner number one, since Alcatraz had some leftover army prisoners. This place has been a military prison before it became the penitentiary renowned as being an inescapable hellhole. Let's just pretend you were one of these prisoners again. You arrive on that train in a place called Tiburon at 9:40 a.m. A barge is waiting in the water there, and that's how you'll get to the island located in San Francisco Bay. The train carriage where you've been sitting could perhaps go down as one of the most well-guarded trains in the history of rail. Imagine if some of the USA's most violent prisoners all got loose, something akin to a movie about the Wild West. No one escapes this day. Many of the men around you are convicted killers, and others are notorious bank robbers. You can make a book out of your combined rap sheets. Each of these guys have been called an agitator, and the authorities have noted that the men are desperate. Most of them have planned prison escapes from other places, and it's well known that they will kill anyone who gets in the way of their freedom. For that reason, you'll be guarded by highly trained men, and when we say highly trained, we don't mean in rehabilitation. They are men that were chosen for their toughness, not their ability to help improve prisoners' behavior. The two men in charge, the warden and his assistant, have been nicknamed the Iron Men. When you finally get to the ferry ship that will take you to the island, you are handcuffed with another man, and both of you are shackled together. You're ordered to walk 10 feet forward and cross a gangplank, and then onto the ship. You're surrounded by law enforcement and prison guards. All this is happening without the press looking on because the authorities have kept the operation a secret. Only one lone photographer got news of the move. At Alcatraz's dock, you and the guy you're chained to walk between rows of guards. 2 by 2, you're marched through the gate into the yard and then into the cell house. You're searched and given a number, after which you're allocated a cell. Now your cuffs are removed and you are free of the other man. But before you can go into your cell, you're taken to the bathhouse and stripped naked. You're examined in every nook and cranny of your body, and then told you can wash. You're then taken to a cell and the door is locked. Outside is a sign that has your name and number. The authorities will later say that the entire operation went perfectly. Okay, so what does your cell look like? You're assigned to Block B. You might move to C later, and Block A, you'll learn, isn't used much at all to incarcerate men. D Block is solitary, a segregation center where a prisoner can be locked up 24 hours a day. These cells are sometimes referred to as confinement chambers. You might get let out in the yard for an hour once a week if you get on the right side of the guards, but other than that, you face total isolation if you're sent there. So your cell in Block B is 5 feet by 9 feet. Proverbially speaking, if you were to swing a cat in there, you'd kill it. Inside that cell is a cot that you can sleep on, and it's made out of steel. It folds against the wall when not being used because there really isn't that much space in the cell. There's a steel shelf to sit on and a steel shelf to put things on. There's also a basin and a toilet. Everything you own when you first get into that cell is a toothbrush, some tooth powder, 2 towels, and a cup. There will be books to read, so you can fill that shelf at some point. You will be able to get visits if you're good, but only once a month and non-contact. If you fall sick, then there's a hospital in the prison. Over the coming year, some big names will arrive at the prison, including the man known as George Machine Gun Kelly. Others that arrive have been convicted of what the press call most atrocious crimes. Alcatraz is called the end of the line, the last resort. It holds formidable robbers and ruthless murderers, and it especially holds anyone who has tried to escape from another prison, or a prisoner that has hurt or killed a prison guard where he was housed. Maybe the most famous criminals to stay on the rock is the mafia crime lord Al Capone. He actually arrives shortly after you. So there you are, sitting in your cell. You receive a booklet, and it's called Regulations for Inmates USP Alcatraz. It tells you that what you have right now is what you're entitled to. The clothes on your back, the roof over your head, and some bathroom items. Anything else you might receive is a privilege, and to get more things you'll have to show good conduct and a good work ethic. You might even get some time taken off your sentence. But show bad conduct and the opposite might happen. You might lose privileges, get some time added on, or be sent to those isolation cells. This is nothing you haven't read before. In bold letters, the booklet tells you that there will be no trading, gambling, selling, giving, or loaning. They mean this too. You will work 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. The rest of the time will be recreation time and cell time. You can watch a movie twice a month, and if you show good conduct, you'll be able to go out to the yard and play handball. You're also told that this won't happen just yet since your first 30 days will be spent in your cell. This is called the quarantine period. It doesn't sound too bad, only you guess the guards will be stricter. That is very true. You'll wake up at 7 a.m. and you'll be counted. You must be absolutely silent during this time or you'll be disciplined. This rule of silence will be the thing that gets to you the most, and the guards are serious about it. You might have your own cell, but the silence kills you. You can try talking through the toilet bowl, but that will get you in serious trouble. You can talk when you eat with the other prisoners. The food at least isn't that bad. In fact, you're quite impressed with the chow. For breakfast one day, you get oatmeal, milk, sausage, fried potatoes, toast, and coffee. For dinner, you get some bean soup, roast beef, and veg. For your supper, you get pork and beans, salad, more coffee, and bread. On another day, the breakfast is similar, but dinner consists of breaded cod, potato chowder, cabbage bread, and tea. For supper one evening, you get vegetable soup, spaghetti and meatballs, fruit pudding and bread. They even throw in some spiced apples. What's going on? You're eating better than you did on the outside, and a lot better than the many Americans living in abject poverty. In the years to come, the delicious food at Alcatraz will become legendary, and it'll make any prisoner in the present day wish he was taken back in time as he chows down on his single slice of moldy bread and dubious slop filled with mystery meat and gristle. At Alcatraz, the wardens believe that healthy food and tasty food will lead to good behavior and cut down on violence. 3 good meals a day should keep the prisoner in good physical and mental health. You are what you eat, and your warden believes slop doesn't align with good behavior. Alcatraz is quite progressive in this respect. Okay, so you've got your pounded beef steak with gravy and mash, and you're not going to complain about that. The silence thing gets to you, but as you follow all the rules, you at least get time on the yard and books to read. It's a bit cramped in the cell, but at least you don't have to share with a man who has a history of atrocious violence. What can go wrong? Well, that routine is so strict that it can feel oppressive. It's final lockup at 4:50 p.m. and lights out at 9:30 p.m. And until the next day, you're not supposed to make a sound. A man named Edward Watke doesn't take to Alcatraz very well. He's prisoner number 47, and he's the first man to take his life in there. More will follow. There is bullying, of course, and this leads one man to severely hurt himself. He wants to get transferred because of the bullying he faces daily. So for you, as long as you don't get bullied, life could be okay. You just have to adhere to the strictest of routines. You even get to go to the library, and since you're eating well and exercising, you might actually get rehabilitated. In fact, as an average prisoner, you'll get to go through almost 100 books a year. As the years go by, you'll get the chance to use a musical instrument and listen to a radio. The problem is, what if you don't follow the rules? Well, that's when Alcatraz turns into Hellcatraz. Let's just add that it's very easy to break the rules. That code of silence is enforced with enthusiasm, and you also have to look presentable at all times. Your cell has to be spotless, and come rain or shine, you have to work really hard. There's no shirking at Alcatraz, and so you might say it's run in a zero-tolerance style. Now, with that in mind, the place is full of notorious criminals with problems of self-control. Things can go wrong. Let's say one day you just can no longer cope with the oppressive rules and you start talking at night and not cleaning your cell. You're sent to isolation, and then you do the same again. You hit out at people and talk back to guards. That's when you go to D block and get put in one of the cells from 9 to 14. This is known as the hole, and before you get thrown in there, you're stripped naked and beaten. The guards will come back and torture you now and again. You lie on a cold concrete floor and there is no light that comes into the cell. You can shower once a week, and you might get out in the yard for an hour in the week. The rest of the time is spent in that cold, dark cell, being treated worse than an animal. You're given no toothbrush or soap to clean yourself. At one point, a guard throws cold water on you. The cell stinks like a sewer, too, and you can forget about that tasty food. You're given 4 slices of bread a day, and then once a week you get a proper meal. In conclusion, Alcatraz is a foreboding place just to look at, and it comes with ruthless men who might bully and kill you. The food is good, but some men just can't cope with the rules. This is what one of your fellow inmates says about that. Men go slowly insane under the exquisite torture of restricted and undeviating routine. Men crack, and then they're punished, sometimes severely, and this happens a lot. The question is, will you crack or will you get through it? You and the rest of your platoon are pinned down. Enemies are closing in from all sides. Bullets whiz above your head and ricochet off the building you're holding out from. You've been in some bad situations before, but this might be the worst one yet. You don't see any clear way out other than a body bag. You decide to call in air support. But can any amount of air support save you? There are just too many enemies. Then you hear a response over the radio. Angel of Death is above your position, hunkered down. We got this, says the voice on the radio. All of a sudden, the sky lights up with gunfire from the heavens. You watch the enemy be completely wiped out by your saviors above. This might sound like a story out of the Bible or a sci-fi thriller, but this is how thousands of US soldiers have been supported in battles around the world. The Angel of Death refers to the AC-130 gunship. Its remarkable firepower and long range allows it to provide aerial fire support for long periods of time. Air support from the Angel of Death always has devastating consequences for the enemy. Gunships started with the AC-47. This aircraft was codenamed Spooky. and used in the 1960s to support ground troops. During the Vietnam War, the gunships were used to provide extra firepower when troops needed support. The AC-47 showed the world what a gunship was capable of. Sure, it had limitations, but it's hard to argue with the successful results after a gunship came through a battlefield. Imagine being in a squad that's pinned down in the dense Vietnamese jungle. You're in the firefight with Viet Cong soldiers. You've been ambushed and you and your men are in dire straits. There are casualties on both sides as bullets fly and grenades explode. The problem is that you're outnumbered. The longer the battle goes on, the closer you are to running out of ammo. One of your squad mates calls for support. From the sky above, machine gun rounds rain down on the enemy, bombs fall and decimate the retreating enemy troops. You look up in the sky and see an AC-47 circling above you. Sunlight gleams off of its metal hull. The AC-47 continues to circle and provide support, but eventually it pulls out of its circling maneuver and the pilot radios that they're low on fuel and ammunition. The gunship has to return to base. Although the AC-47 rescued you and your squad, some of the enemy was able to get away. If only the AC-47 had a longer flight time and more ammunition. Enter the C-130 Hercules. This gunship provided more cargo space for weapons and ammunition. It also had a much higher fuel capacity than its predecessor, meaning it could fly longer missions. The longer the gunship could stay in the air, the more damage could be done to the enemy. Now when you called in for a gunship, the C-130 could circle and fire down on enemies for a long period of time. If your squad ever needed to call in for air support again, you could be sure that the C-130 would finish off the enemy completely. Toward the end of the Vietnam War, gunships underwent one more airframe change. This led to the AC-130. It was the gunship of choice for the US military and was extremely successful. The military still uses this basic airframe today. Over the years, new technology has been added to make it the angel of death that enemies fear. The original and unofficial nickname for the AC-130 when it was first introduced was Puff the Magic Dragon, or Puff for short. That name didn't stick, however. Maybe it was because a big purple dragon was not as intimidating as the Angel of Death. Or maybe the heads of the military weren't so keen on having one of their most deadly weapons associated with the cannabinoid drug. The AC-130 was and still is successful for many different reasons. The basic model has 4 Allison T56A15 turboprop engines, which give the aircraft 17,200 horsepower. It has a wingspan of 133 feet and a length of 98 feet, which provides ample room for ammunition and mounted guns. It can reach 300 miles per hour and has a range of 1,300 miles. It is normally loaded with 30mm and 105mm cannons and 25mm Gatling guns to mow down any enemy targets that threaten US soldiers on the ground. Basically, it's like having a fleet of flying tanks as aerial support, and all for only $210 million a plane. The AC-130 Angel of Death gunships made their debut toward the end of the Vietnam War. The Air Force knew they'd found the right plane for the job when the AC-130 destroyed more than 10,000 enemy trucks and provided numerous life-saving close air support missions for ground soldiers. After the Vietnam War, the AC-130 provided support for ground troops in battles all around the world. In the 1980s, the military used them in the Americas mostly. In 1983, the Angel of Death was sent to Grenada for Operation Urgent Fury. The gunship played a vital role in supporting paratroopers and Navy SEAL squads as they fought their way across the island to dismantle a dangerous military regime who had taken control of the island. After Operation Urgent Fury, the Angel of Death was used in Panama for Operation Just Cause, where it was used to destroy military installations and bunkers around the country. In the 90s, most of the United States gunships were stationed in the Middle East. There was also several missions in Somalia for Operation Restore Hope and Bosnia for Operation Deliberate Force. These missions happened in 1993 and 1995 respectively. The first time the Angel of Death was used in the Middle East was during Operation Desert Storm in 1991. In the early 2000s, it was used again during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The AC-130 is still being used in conflicts in the Middle East, but what is it like to be inside the Angel of Death? To be the one who is in charge of unleashing the full fury of the AC-130 against enemy troops? We know that from the ground, all a soldier needs to do is hunker down and wait until the firing stops. Then they can be sure the coast is clear. But what does it take to be part of the AC-130 crew? Imagine you're sitting in the flight hangar waiting for orders. You and some of the other soldiers are playing poker or watching episodes of the Infographics show. It is your favorite YouTube channel. Then all of a sudden a siren sounds. You and your crewmates grab your gear and enter the open maw leading into the belly of the plane. Black letters run along the side of the green hull, spelling out the Angel of Death. You take your seat in the gunner station and strap in. The propeller engines spin to life and you take off into the sky toward a pinned-down squad requesting air support. You're flying in one of the newly upgraded AC-130s. It has state-of-the-art targeting equipment and upgraded weapon capabilities. You know that as soon as you reach your target, you can unleash hell on the enemy. You hear the pilot through your headset. He informs the crew that the plane is about to enter into the firing zone. You feel the AC-130 bank right and to begin its 360-degree circle around the hostiles on the ground. The screen in front of you flashes to life and you're bathed in the luminescent green glow of the night vision display. You can see individual bodies from the thermal imaging. Nothing is going to get by you. You're given the signal to go weapons hot. Let's do this, you say. You watch your monitor and select the newly upgraded 30mm cannons and Gatling guns. There are enemy troops advancing quickly on your allies. You unleash bullets from the guns, mowing down the enemy soldiers in their tracks. The plane carries more than enough ammunition for such a mission, so there's no need to be shy with the bullets. Your guns can fire up to 200 rounds a minute, so there are enough bullets for everyone. You hold down the trigger to force the remaining enemy troops to take cover. The dirt in front of the enemy explodes from the impact of bullets, and they're sent running for cover. You then see a new supply of troops headed toward the battlefield in an enemy transport. You switch over to the GBU-39 small-diameter bombs. These devices have precision guidance systems built into them. Once you mark a target for destruction, your bombs will hit it every single time. The enemy truck approaches the pinned-down squad. You take aim and fire. The bombs fall through the sky and detonate on top of the truck. Shards of metal and rubber fly through the air. The enemy vehicle goes up in flames as the Angel of Death continues to circle above. The enemy is no match for your firepower. Next, you switch to the 105mm M102 howitzer cannon. It's time to get serious. You see an enemy tank come around one of the buildings. It stops and takes aim at the location of your allies on the ground. Your M102 can fire 10 50-pound shells per minute with precision accuracy, but you know you'll only need one good shot. You line up the howitzer targeting the enemy tank. You take a deep breath to make sure your aim is perfect, then you fire. The shell soars through the air and embeds itself in the top of the tank. The round detonates and the tank is destroyed. Threat neutralized. The pilot of your AC-30 notices that anti-aircraft vehicles have moved into position on the left side of the plane, and it would take too long to maneuver the plane to fire at the enemy using the guns on the right side. You would be blown out of the sky before you had a chance to fire a single round. Luckily, the Angel of Death has complementary weapons on both sides of the plane. It doesn't matter which way the enemy is firing from, the gunship has it covered. You flip a switch and your screen switches over to the guns on the left side of the plane. There's no time to waste. You fire all weapons at the anti-aircraft vehicles that are trying to shoot you out of the sky. Every single one of your shots is a direct hit. Nothing can stop you and the Angel of Death. You switch back over to the guns on the right side of the plane and continue to provide aerial support. The pilot signals an evac helicopter that it's time to move in. The chopper lands on the outside of the building that the pinned-down squad is held up in. The entire squad rushes out of the building and into the helicopter. It lifts off and flies your brothers in arms to safety. Your AC-130 lands at the airbase. You meet up with the squad you just rescued, and everyone gets a high five and a cold beer. It's good to have an Angel of Death ready to support ground troops at a moment's notice. The plane gets refueled and you take the night off to continue watching awesome videos from the Infographics show. When you wake up the next day, you are handed blueprints for the new line of the AC-130 gunships. They're being built and prototyped in a few months. You see that the aircraft itself is lighter and more efficient. The new AC-130 burns 25 to 30% less fuel than the current gunships. It has a top speed of 416 miles per hour, which is over 100 miles per hour faster than the current AC-130s. The new models are equipped with 6-blade propeller engines instead of the standard 4-blade props to make it much more efficient. This gives the new model a 3,000-mile range. That more than doubles the flight distance of the current AC-130s. It's amazing what new technology can do. You also hear top-secret rumors that the new AC-130 Angel of Death will be outfitted with combat lasers. This is some futuristic firepower, but how cool would that be? You think about all the missions AC-130s have carried out, how many battles have been won and lives saved because of the air support the Angel of Death provides. It's no wonder that these aircrafts have been around for over 50 years. All you know is that you're glad the Angel of Death is on your side. In December 1978, Chicago police were just beginning to uncover the evidence of one of the most heinous crimes their city had ever seen, as body after body was pulled out from under the floorboards of a seemingly ordinary suburban home. Investigators realized that they were dealing with America's most evil serial killer, John Wayne Gacy, also known as the Killer Clown. had murdered more people than any one person in U.S. history at that point in time. John Wayne Gacy was a well-known and well-liked figure in his suburban community north of Chicago. He owned a successful construction business, attended church faithfully, and was involved in the local Polish community. He was married to his second wife and seemed to be a devoted stepfather to her 2 daughters. Through his position as a precinct captain for the Democratic Party, Gacy had the opportunity to meet and be photographed with First Lady Rosalynn Carter in early 1978, the very same year that his horrific crimes would become public. At the time, though, Gacy was loved and admired by his neighbors, friends, and the police, and had been known for hosting elaborate parties for his entire neighborhood. Gacy's alter ego, Pogo the Clown, was often a feature of these parties, and neighbors recall that he seemed to enjoy dressing up in his clown costume and makeup and entertaining local children. But underneath Gacy's idyllic suburban life, he was hiding a dark past. Prior to moving to Chicago, Gacy had been living in Iowa, where he was arrested for assaulting 2 young men while his first wife was in the hospital giving birth to his child. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but after serving 18 months in jail, a now divorced Gacy was released on parole and received permission from the courts to relocate to Chicago for a fresh start. Soon, though, Gacy's community and the world at large would learn that these secrets paled in comparison to the sadistic double life that Gacy had been leading for years. After telling his second wife that he was bisexual, the 2 divorced in 1976, and Gacy, now free to indulge his most sick and twisted fantasies, soon learned that killing was more satisfying to him than anything else, and he would spend the next several years trying to get his fix in the most horrific ways. It all started to unravel for Gacy with the disappearance of Robert Piest. On December 11, 1976, Robert's mother arrived to pick him up from his shift at the pharmacy where he worked. When his shift ended, Robert told his mother that he was going to talk to a man about a potential construction job that would pay more than double what he was making at the pharmacy. He told her it would only take a few minutes and then they could go home and enjoy his mother's birthday celebration. She waited outside the pharmacy, but Robert never came back. His panicked mother went home and returned to the pharmacy with her husband, other children, and the family's 2 German shepherds, but they could find no sign of Robert. The worried family then drove immediately to the police station to report their son missing. Lieutenant Kozenczak, whose son attended the same high school as Robert, took their report. One of the first calls he made was to John Wayne Gacy. Gacy's friends and neighbors may have been oblivious to his dark past, but the police were not. Not only were they aware of his past convictions, but they had also received numerous complaints about Gacy in recent years. In 1975, after an employee of Gacy's construction company went missing, the man's family pleaded with police to investigate Gacy, but their pleas were ignored. In 1976, police had run surveillance on Gacy's home related to the disappearance of a 9-year-old boy, but they were unable to build a case against him. In 1977, a young man complained to the police about Gacy, alleging that Gacy had kidnapped him at gunpoint and assaulted him. Gacy was arrested and even admitted to his encounter with the young man, but he claimed that it was consensual and prosecutors declined to press charges. Police were also beginning to suspect that Gacy was behind a string of complaints about a man named John who had been cruising local parks and picking up young men, many of whom seemed to disappear after their encounter with John. Despite these incidents, Gacy had managed to stay one step ahead of the law so far, but his luck was about to run out. After Robert's family made their missing persons report, officers quickly realized that the man he had gone to see about a construction job must have been John Wayne Gacy. His construction company had just recently finished a renovation job at the very pharmacy where Robert had worked. The coincidence was too much to ignore, and this time the police seriously considered Gacy as a suspect in the disappearance of Robert Piest. Little did they know that this particular crime was just the tip of the iceberg, and they were about to uncover one of the most gruesome crime sprees in history. Lieutenant Kozenczak contacted Gacy and asked him to come into the police station for an interview. Gacy was cordial and agreed to come in, telling officers he could be there within half an hour. Hours went by with no sign of Gacy. Officers were beginning to get suspicious when at 3 a.m., Gacy suddenly appeared at the station. His arrival did little to calm their suspicions. Gacy was more than 4 hours late to his interview, and when he arrived, he was covered in mud and grime. The officer that Gacy had come to see wasn't available, so he was sent on his way. Later, officers would learn that Gacy's car had been towed from a snowbank near the Des Plaines River at 2 a.m. immediately before he arrived at the police station. Armed with this information, officers served Gacy with a search warrant when he returned the following day for his interview. He reluctantly handed over his keys and was detained at the station while officers searched his home. There, they found a receipt for a roll of film that Robert's family confirmed belonged to him. Police concluded that Robert had been in Gacy's home, but they could find no evidence of a crime, and so Gacy was released and placed under surveillance. The next day, officers found a ring that they linked to another missing boy, and employees of Gacy's construction company told police about 2 different employees of Gacy's who had mysteriously gone missing in recent months. A few days later, Gacy had the audacity to invite the officers on surveillance duty outside of his home inside for a cup of coffee. Once inside his home, both officers noticed the unmistakable stench of death. That same day, Gacy's lawyers filed a lawsuit against the police department for harassment, but before long, Gacy would have much bigger legal issues to worry about. While he was under 24-hour surveillance, officers witnessed Gacy selling marijuana to a gas station clerk, and they jumped on the opportunity to arrest him. While Gacy was in custody for drug-related charges, police officers threatened to tear up the floorboards in his home, prompting him to admit to murder. He tells officers that yes, he did kill a man in his home, but claims that it was self-defense. He shows police the exact spot under his garage where he buried the body, and during their search for the body, officers find a trap door leading to a crawl space under Gacy's home. Inside, amid the terrible stench of decay, officers find parts of at least 3 other bodies. Once he realized that the police had found the first bodies, Gacy cracked. In a rambling, hours-long confession in which he referred to himself in the third person, Gacy told police that John or Jack had killed at least 32 young men and that he had buried 27 of the bodies on his property, and he had disposed of the rest, including the body of Robert Piest in the Des Plaines River. In fact, Gacy had been dumping Robert's body in that same river on the night he was towed out of the snowbank before he showed up at the police station covered in mud. Gacy was charged with the murder of Robert Piest, although police had yet to find his body. By January 8, 1979, police had uncovered the remains of 29 bodies, but only 7 had been positively identified. Gacy was charged with the murders of 7 young men as police continued their efforts to identify the rest of the victims. Parents of missing boys from around the world contacted the Chicago police to find out if their sons were among Gacy's victims, and forensic specialists and dentists were called in to help identify the bodies using dental records, which, in the time before DNA testing, was the most reliable method of identifying victims. In April 1979, a grand jury indicted Gacy on a total of 33 murders, the largest number attributed to one person in U.S. history at the time. Throughout this, Gacy continued to give interviews to the police and even described his first murder to officers in gruesome detail. He admitted that he had stabbed his victim to death in his bedroom before burying him in the crawl space, and police found a large blood stain on the underside of the bedroom carpet that matched his story. Investigators also found a red light and a police radio in Gacy's car, prompting them to conclude that he had posed as a police officer in order to kidnap his victims. As the trial date loomed, police had still not found Robert Piest's body, but they had found his jacket under the floor of Gacy's laundry room. In January 1979, during the height of the investigation into the killer clown, the Chicago Metropolitan Clown Guild held a press conference, stating that the Gacy investigation was negatively impacting the city's professional clowns. Parents were too afraid to have their children near a clown after the details of Gacy's crimes and his alter ego Pogo the Clown were made public. Gacy's friends and neighbors recalled that he frequently joked about how clowns can get away with murder, though at the time they thought he was referring to his tendency to grope women while in costume. Gacy's trial began on February 6, 1980. Due to the graphic nature of the crimes and the evidence, the judge banned anyone under the age of 16 from the courtroom. Gacy, who was facing the death penalty, pled not guilty to the charges, and his lawyers attempted to launch a defense based on insanity. But after a 5-week trial, it took the jury just 2 hours to find John Wayne Gacy guilty of the heinous murder of 33 young men. State Attorney Bernard Carey was quoted as saying, "He certainly qualifies for the death penalty. If he doesn't, who does?" Gacy was sentenced to death by lethal injection and sent to Menard Correctional Center to await his execution. Gacy would spend the next several years on death row while his automatic appeals were exhausted. During his time on death row, Gacy took up art, painting numerous creepy pictures, of course, of clowns. Several of Gacy's paintings were auctioned off along with other inmates' art to raise money to buy art supplies for prisoners. Years later, after Gacy's death, 2 local businessmen purchased 30 of these paintings and invited the families of his victims to destroy them in a public bonfire. After nearly 15 years on death row, all of Gacy's appeals were exhausted, and his execution date was set for May 10, 1994. Gacy's last meal consisted of fried shrimp, a pound of fresh strawberries, and a bucket of KFC chicken with fries. Prior to his murder spree and subsequent incarceration, Gacy had actually managed 3 KFC restaurants owned by his former father-in-law. As he was strapped into the gurney awaiting his execution, Gacy was asked if he had any last words. He snarled at his executioners, "Kiss my ass." And at 12:58 a.m. he was executed by lethal injection. At the time of Gacy's execution, only 26 of his 33 victims had been positively identified. The advent of DNA testing helped police identify more of Gacy's unknown victims, including the 2011 identification of William George Bundy, a Chicago man who told his family he was going to a party and was never seen again. To this day, 6 victims of the killer clown remain unidentified. As a direct result of Gacy's unthinkable crimes, Chicago police spearheaded the creation of a computerized database of missing and murdered children and youths to make it easier for various police departments across the country to communicate and share information in the hopes that similar crimes could be avoided in the future. John Wayne Gacy brutally murdered 33 young men and buried their bodies under the floorboards of his home. He had appeared to be a successful businessman and a pillar of his community, but neighbors would soon learn that appearances can be deceiving. Hiding behind the facade was America's most evil serial killer, John Wayne Gacy, the Killer Clown. Imagine sitting in a prison cell and contemplating life, and how it will be all over quite soon. You're going to be executed by way of hanging, and no doubt you're wondering how that will go. You hope it'll be quick. It's not so much oblivion that scares you, but the fact that hanging might not go exactly as it should, and you'll spend some seconds or even minutes in agonizing pain. It wouldn't be the first time a man has been left dangling with life still in him. One thing you're not considering at all is the possibility of surviving your execution. Never mind surviving 3 attempts to execute you. Welcome to the life of John Lee, the criminal they just couldn't kill. Before we get to the momentous moment in history that tainted the image of the British authorities, and before we investigate the theories as to why the job at hand failed, you need to know a bit about hanging in the first place. That way you might better understand how John Lee escaped with his life intact. Prior to the British getting a bit more humane about this method of execution, it was quite brutal, albeit likely a better way to go than past forms of execution such as being burned or boiled or torn apart at the limbs. Hanging in the old days might have involved climbing onto something and then having your neck put inside a noose. Then the object is taken from under the person and they die from strangulation. In the 19th century, scientists aired their views and said dislocating the neck was a more humane way to kill someone than strangulation on a rope. In 1866, the idea was proposed to drop the person from a certain height to ensure this quick snap and ensuing death. This method was called a standard drop. At the time, a scientist named Samuel Houghton said the height of the drop to secure a fast death should be between 4 and 6 feet. That way there would be no dangling and terrible discomfort. The standard drop was soon seen as backwards due to the fact that it didn't take into account a person's height and weight. In 1872, a new method was introduced that was called the long drop. The person was connected to a noose and stood on a scaffold which had a trap door. When the door was opened, down fell the body. The authorities had to calculate the proportions of the person's body so that the neck would snap and kill the person quickly, but not drop the person so much that he or she would be decapitated. This can and has happened, and while death is death, losing the head was not something anyone wanted to see. So that's where we were around the time of Mr. John Lee is going to go to the scaffold. On November 15, 1884, he murdered a woman named Emma Ann Whitehead Keyes. This happened in a small village called Backrooms, which is in Devon in the south of England. Lee was arrested, but always protested that he was innocent of the crime. But there was some evidence to the contrary, including a knife wound that he had incurred during the murder. The woman had been killed with a knife. Prior to her downfall, Keyes had lived alone with her servants and cooks, and Lee had once worked there too. He left that job, joined the Navy, returned to Devon, and was arrested for stealing. After his release from prison, he returned to the manor and worked for Keyes again. It was perhaps a bad move on her part to take him back in. When she was found dead, there had only been one person in the house at the time, and that was Lee. Then there was the cut on his arm, which pointed at his guilt. Besides that, there wasn't really anything else the police had on him, and in 1884, there was no CSI Devon. Maybe it wasn't him who had committed the murder, and he certainly thought he'd been falsely convicted. He once said, "The reason I'm so calm is that I trust in the Lord, and He knows I'm innocent." He was sentenced to be hanged at Exeter Prison on the 23rd of February, 1884. On the day of the event, the executioner, named James Barry, went through the checks. Scaffold, all good. Noose, correctly tied. Trap door, working fine. What could possibly go wrong? All we know is that Lee was taken to the scaffold and his head was fastened to the noose. A white hood was put over his head, and when the signal was given, the trap door didn't open. They tried again.
and then again. And you can only imagine what was going through Lee's mind after each time he gritted his teeth and prepared for the great unknown. This was a total embarrassment for anyone involved, and the medical officer said enough is enough. He said he can't hang around any longer after those failures. Lee was unfastened from the noose the last time and was taken back to prison. But what actually went wrong since the entire apparatus had been tested? Well, the executioner wrote about the experience as well as some other 130-plus executions in a book called My Experiences as an Executioner. He admitted in that book that the science didn't always work, and some men died too slowly or lost their heads. But Lee's case was extraordinary. These are two excerpts from that book. 1. On the Saturday, I examined this drop and reported it was much too frail for its purpose, but I worked the lever and found that the doors dropped all right. 2. The noise of the bolt sliding could be plainly heard, but the doors did not fall. I stamped on the drop to shake it loose, and so did some of the warders, but none of our efforts could stir it. Lee stood like a statue, making no sound or sign. Between each attempt, they actually took Lee away. He had the hood removed from his head and was taken to a room. The authorities then tried the trapdoor mechanism again, and it worked fine. Lee was brought back out, fastened in the noose, hood put over his head, and they tried it again. It didn't work, 3 times in all. By golly, thought the authorities, the entire experience was frighteningly perturbing and just a little bit disturbing. Executioner Barry wrote that some people believed there was a possibility of the trapdoor being swollen by the rain, but he added that they even cut the door with an axe and a plane, and it still didn't work when it needed to. In the end, he concluded that it was the iron catches that had somehow stuck when Lee's weight was on the trapdoor. It was one of the low points of his career. The British Home Secretary, Sir William Harcourt, commuted Lee's sentence, saying it would shock the feeling of anyone if a man had twice to pay the pangs of imminent death. Lee ended up serving 22 years behind bars. The thing is, investigations years later show that Lee might not have been the only person in the house that night, and he might have been wrongly convicted. Maybe there really was some divine intervention on his part. What's also a mystery is what happened to Lee after he was released. No one really knows, since he just kind of disappeared. Some rumors suggest he kept his head down and he moved to London, while others say he moved abroad. More recent research suggests that he went over the pond and that his grave is in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. That research asserts that he had abandoned his wife and 2 kids in England and started a new life in the States. It's possible he was buried there in 1945.
You would have preferred that they just went ahead and broke your bones, or perhaps ran your head under freezing cold water until you thought you were drowning. It would have been much better than the whiteness, that deafening, unrelenting whiteness. For months on end, you saw no colors at all. The cell was white, the walls, the door, and the floor. Your clothes were white, and all day and night they kept a bright white light shining. When they put food through the door, it was always the same dish, white rice on a white plate. Never did you hear any voices except those inside your head. If you wanted to use the bathroom, you had to slip a piece of white paper under the door, then guards wearing padded shoes would shuffle along silently to open the door, and then you could use the white bathroom. After months of this, you started to forget who you were. The voices in your head became real. You couldn't even remember what your parents looked like. Welcome to the world of white torture. What we just described to you is what sometimes is called an enhanced interrogation technique, and in this case what is referred to as extreme sensory deprivation. The person who suffered it is one Amir Fakhravar, a former prisoner in Iran. His crime was being critical of the Iranian regime. As an activist in the late 90s and early 2000s, he said he was imprisoned and interrogated on a number of occasions. He said that he's been beaten to the extent that his bones were broken, but nothing was as brutal as white torture. The good news for him is when he got out after spending 8 months in that white room, he managed to flee Iran and move to the USA. He was lucky. Other former regime critics who have had a stay at the notorious Evin prison in Iran have described how some inmates were tortured to death there. Some prisoners have been executed at Evin, others had parts of them amputated, some have been blinded, and most were kept in what has been called horrific conditions. Let's stick with Iran for a minute and hear what an Iranian journalist named Ebrahim Nabavi had to say about white torture. In 2004, he got on the phone to Human Rights Watch. This is part of the conversation. Since I left Evin, I've not been able to sleep without sleeping pills. It is terrible. The loneliness never leaves you long after you're free. Every door that's closed on you. This is why we call it white torture. They get what they want without having to hit you. You begin to break, and once you break, they have control, and then you begin to confess. Another former prisoner in one of Iranian's white cells described it like this: "After 3 days, it becomes so difficult. Different people break at different times. We used to talk about when people would break. Some people broke after a few days, some could last much longer. It is absolute silence. After 3 days, I just wanted any words, even if it was swearing, even if it was a harsh interrogation." In a nutshell, that's what white torture is all about: breaking a person. It's when a government, and as you'll see, not only the Iranian government, wants a person to experience hell, and so they tell them what they want to know. It leaves no bruises, no scars, except for the ones of the psychological kind. Has this ever happened to prisoners housed in the USA? According to human rights organizations, the answer is yes. The New York Times in 2019 talked about the CIA's torture program, the enhanced interrogation techniques that have been used at Guantanamo Bay and other black sites, such as a secret prison the CIA had in Thailand. The techniques used included things such as keeping men in stress positions so they couldn't sleep for days, or waterboarding prisoners, or keeping men confined in a small box where they couldn't properly sit. The organization, called European Democratic Lawyers, wrote that interrogatory technicians working at the Guantanamo facility would sometimes take men and cover their eyes and ears. They'd then put thick gloves on the prisoners' hands and tie their feet. This kind of sensory deprivation was called a kind of white torture, but it sounds more like dark torture. Still, the outcome is the same. The prisoner begins to lose his mind. A similar thing went down at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, and the world got to know about this after a series of photos were released. The US Army would at times dress men in boiler suits, tie them, put masks over their mouths, and cover their eyes and ears. The result of the torture would always be a numbing of the prisoner's senses, so much so that they began to mentally unravel. But the British were doing a similar thing a long time before it happened in Iraq. In the 70s, people suspected of being involved with the Irish Republican Army were taken from their homes or off the streets without standing trial. They were then taken to a secret interrogation center and were put through something called the 5 techniques. Those were hooding, wall standing, deprivation of sleep, subjection to noise, and deprivation of food and drink. When the men were in their cells, they were handcuffed and hooded, so they were literally in the dark all the time. To make things worse, the British continuously played a recording of a hissing noise, or what's being called a kind of white noise. The prisoners might at times get kicked in the groin, having not even knowing someone had entered their cell. This created constant stress and the inability to sleep. What was the object of this sensory deprivation? It was to cause the worst kind of depression, crippling anxiety, and after a while hallucinations and even a loss of consciousness. The Brits used it in the Iraq War too, and imported it to the US, Israel, and Brazil. How did countries get away with this? Well, they say it's not strictly torture and more enhanced interrogation, something human rights groups have been criticizing for years. In Venezuela, the authorities have their own unique take on white torture. Underneath a building in the city of Caracas, there's a place called La Tumba, or the tomb in English. There, prisoners are kept in tiny cells that are painted white. They're not allowed any interaction with guards or other prisoners, and they can hear no sounds. All day and night, a bright light shines in their cell, and so after a while, the prisoners have no idea what time it is. Not surprisingly, there are reports of some of them trying to kill themselves. Others might suffer from vomiting, diarrhea, or hallucinations. One mother of an inmate told the media he's buried alive, practically waiting to die. Could you survive white torture? We doubt it. We doubt anyone could get through white torture without succumbing to madness. Human Rights Watch spoke to a former inmate of a place called Prison 59 in Iran. That prisoner had seen the isolation cells and had this to say about them: "I cannot imagine spending one night in those solitary cells without losing my mind." And it's not just about what happens in the white rooms, but what happens once you get out. As one former detainee in Iran said, "I went in as one person and came out another person." You would think that when strapped to a gurney, knowing the life force in you is about to expire, you'd want to say something nice to someone, or profound, or perhaps apologize to the family of the victim that's watching your demise. Then again, if you were an innocent person about to have his veins filled with a lethal cocktail, you might not be in the mood to deliver a tender speech. You might also be a ruthless and heartless psychopath that wants to fill the air one last time with your monstrous voice. As you'll now find out, that has happened, and it might send shivers down your spine hearing what they said. First up, Richard Aaron Cobb. Cobb was executed by lethal injection in 2013 in Texas. His crime was walking into a convenience store with an accomplice and robbing it. It didn't stop there. They took 2 female employees and 1 male customer and forced them into a car. They took them to a secluded place and shot them execution style, and then drove away thinking they were all dead. Only the man actually died. His last words were very strange, starting out nihilistic. He then finished with something very surprising. "I hope that someday this absurdity that humanity has come to will come to an end." And then seconds later after he started to pass away. Wow, this is great. Thank you, Warden. This next one is slightly more gruesome. John Wayne Gacy. You all know the story of this man, and we won't go into detail about what he did. He murdered 33 people in the 70s and hid many of the bodies under his house. He is one of the USA's worst serial killers. His last words show that he had no remorse whatsoever. They were, "Kiss my..." We can't say that last word, otherwise the video will get demonetized. But we are sure you can guess what it is. There's no cursing in this next one, but we think you'll agree it's pretty darn dark. Peter Kürten. You've never heard of this guy, we bet. He was a German serial killer at a time where there were few of them about in Germany. That was the early 20th century. He killed at least 9 people and did terrible things with the bodies. One other thing was that he drank the blood of his victims, and that's why he was sometimes named the Vampire of Dusseldorf. In 1931, he was beheaded by guillotine, and just before that happened, he looked at his psychiatrist and said, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." Before the blade came down, the psychiatrist replied, "No." Eileen Wuornos. This woman you might have seen portrayed in a Hollywood movie called Monster. She worked selling her body on the streets and killed 6 of her male customers. She claimed she was defending herself, but that didn't hold up in court. She's now known as one of America's worst female serial killers. She was executed in 2002, and just before that, she promised she'd come back to life again. She said, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." Sticking with serial murderers, this next monster fits the bill. Carl Panzram. This guy was a serial killer in the US at the start of the 20th century. He committed murders among many other despicable things. He said he had killed 22 people in all. He was sentenced to be hanged in 1930, and just before the executioner put the cover on his head, he spat in his face. He was asked if he had any last words. This is how he replied. "Yes, hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill a dozen men while you're screwing around." In case you're wondering, a Hoosier is someone from the state of Indiana. Up next is arguably the funniest on this list, James French. French killed 2 people in the late 50s and mid-60s in the USA. One of those people was his cellmate. The 2 didn't get along very well. His actual last words when sitting in the electric chair were, "There's nothing else to say." But the last thing he said to a reporter was this: "If I were covering my execution, do you know what I'd say in the newspaper headline tomorrow?" The reporter said, "What?" He answered, "French fries." Yep, that was amusing. We think this next guy was also attempting to make a joke. Jeffrey Matthews. Matthews shot and killed his uncle during a robbery, and he was executed in 2011 in Oklahoma because of that. His last words aren't exactly frightening, but his dark sense of humor at the end is perhaps a little bit shocking. He said a few things, but his very last words were, "I think that governor's phone is broke. He hasn't called yet." Robert Charles Comer. You can say the same about this man. At the end, he either had a twisted sense of humor or was on another planet, mentally speaking. In 1987, he killed a man, but he had also committed some other serious crimes throughout his life. When he asked if he wanted to say something at the end, he said, "Go Raiders." That's in reference to an American football team. Such a statement, you might assume, encapsulates how little he thought about himself and life and his victims. Robert Alton Harris. Alton was executed in California in 1992 for multiple murders. He'd been a career criminal with a long rap sheet, although his killing of 2 boys is why he got the gas chamber. He was incredibly heartless if you read his story, but we won't go into it today. At the end, he became poetic, his last words being, "You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everybody dances with the Grim Reaper." He's not wrong about that. He's not as amusing as the next person, though. Vincent Gutierrez. This guy was executed in Texas in 2007 after being found guilty of killing a man. Gutierrez had been trying to steal the man's car and then shot him in the back. He was under the age of 18 when it happened. He said a few things for his last words and apologized for what he had done. But then he finished it off by saying, "Where's my stunt double when you need one?" John William Rook. Rook believed his difficult childhood was the reason he committed a murder in 1980 in the US. He had 12 hot dogs for his last meal. And then, just before they took his life away, he thanked them and said, "Freedom, freedom at last."
James W. Rogers. Rogers was sentenced to death after killing a fellow worker at a uranium mine in 1957. The two had fallen out over quite a big issue, and that was how a scoop shovel should be properly greased. They didn't see eye to eye regarding the grease, and Rogers shot the other man. He was sentenced to death by firing squad. When Rogers was ready to have the firing squad finish his life, he was asked if he had any final words. His reply was, "I done told you my last request, a bulletproof vest." Charlie Livingston. In 1983, this man shot and killed a woman in Houston during a robbery. He didn't seem to see the point of final words when the time came, and he made that point, saying, "You all brought me here to be executed, not to make a speech. That's it." That was simple enough, quite different from what's coming up. Douglas Roberts. This man from Texas was quite the opposite, and he had quite a lot to say on the day of his execution by lethal injection in 2005. He'd been found guilty of kidnapping, robbery, and murder. When the time came for his last words, he said, "I've been hanging around this popsicle stand way too long. Before I leave, I want to tell you all, when I die, bury me deep, lay 2 speakers at my feet, put some headphones on my head, and rock and roll me when I'm dead." The media later reported that he was upbeat and animated before his execution. Frederick Wood. Wood was another joker, albeit with a dark sense of humor. He was put to the electric chair in 1963 for the crime of murder. When asked what his final words would be, he replied, "Gents, this is an educational project. You're about to witness the damaging effect electricity has on wood." The next couple of people you could say are unique on this list. Mary Blandy. Now we're going really back in time, and this is the story of an English woman whose father didn't approve of her relationship. She looked to poison to deal with this problem. She was hanged in 1752, and at the time she was wearing a dress. She was worried people might look up the dress, even though it wouldn't matter much after she was dead. Still, she told the executioner, "For the sake of decency, gentlemen, don't hang me high." Sarah Good. Now we go even farther back to the Salem trials in Massachusetts in 1692. Good was in her 30s when she was accused of being a witch and then sentenced to death. All 12 jurors agreed that she had to be a witch. She was accused of lacking in self-discipline and being a servant of the devil. She had only challenged locals regarding their very strict Puritan values, but they had said that made her in league with Satan. The Reverend Nicholas Noyes was there at the end and still tried to get her to confess, and she of course refused. Her last words were, "I'm no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." 25 years later, Noyes had an aneurysm, and as the story goes, he coughed up blood and choked on it. We should say this is what's called popular legend. But as the witch trials were so terrible, we imagine many people might hope it happened. While these witch trials were madness to the highest degree, Mary's husband at least sued the courts for what's happened to her, and he won. Now we go back to the present day and a couple of guys that look death straight in the eye. Clarence Ray Allen. This man was executed in California for killing 3 people. He was executed in 2006 when he was the ripe old age of 76. He was very sick at the time, and a lot of people wondered why the death sentence, since it seemed he didn't have much time left anyway. His last words were, "Hoka hey, it's a good day to die." Melvin White. White had committed the terrible crime of murdering a child, and he was executed in Texas in 2005. We won't go into the details, but what he did shocked a lot of people. Not many folks felt sorry for this man as he went to the gurney for his dose of lethal drugs. He did say he was sorry for what he did and then said, "All right, Warden, let's give them what they want." The next couple of people you might say didn't sit too well in their chair of death. Tory Twain McNabb. In 2017, this man was given lethal injection in the state of Alabama. He'd been convicted of killing a police officer. He and his lawyers had tried to stop it going through by saying the punishment was cruel and unusual, but that didn't work. He went to the gurney an angry man, and with both his hands, he pointed 2 middle fingers in the air. He then said, "Mom, sis, look at my eyes. I got no tears. I'm unafraid. To the state of Alabama, I hate you. I hate you. I hate you." Thomas J. Grasso. We have perhaps saved the strangest last words to last. And this was the execution of a man that had been convicted of 2 murders of elderly women. He was given lethal injection in the state of Oklahoma in 1995. He wrote a short poem before his death, and part of it went like this: "The warden will read my last creed, and the deadly brew will flow, as the poison drips into my veins, and from my body life does drain." But his last words were in the form of a very practical complaint. We guess he was being ironic. Those words were, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs. I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this." It's the early 1980s, and over the sky of the American heartland, Soviet and Cuban paratroopers begin to fall from the sky.
In minutes, thousands of communist invaders have gained a foothold in the very heart of America. With World War III in full swing, it's up to a band of plucky teenagers to fight a guerrilla war against the godless commies. If you grew up in the 80s or just plain don't have bad taste in movies, then you're well aware of the action hit Red Dawn, a film that portrays a Soviet invasion of the United States toward the end of the Cold War. No, we're not talking about the remake. We don't speak of the remake. But film aside, could it really happen? That question was asked by Infographics show fan Blazik, who wanted to know if someone were to invade America, could the US pull all its forces home and hold out against a foreign invader? Despite what fiction like Red Dawn would have you believe, the United States was never in any danger of an invasion by the Soviet Union, mostly because the Russian people were about as interested in invading the US as Americans were in invading the Soviet Union. Of course, that didn't stop politicians and military officials on both sides using the fear of an evil capitalist or communist invasion from ballooning defense budgets. The saddest fact of the Cold War just might be that despite all the preparations to defend from an invasion by both sides, neither NATO nor the Soviet bloc ever had a single war plan drawn up for an actual preemptive invasion of the other's territory. But another major reason why the US was never under any threat of an invasion is due to its unique place in the world geography. In order for an enemy to get to America, first it must cross two massive oceans, and this geographic fact makes the United States the single most secure nation on Earth. Even today, moving troops and equipment across the oceans is a massive undertaking in terms of both logistics and cost, and very few nations are even capable of attempting the feat. But let's say that the two leading peer competitors to the US decided to join forces and team up against the United States. With all troops returned home from overseas, could the US defend itself against a double-sided assault against it by China and Russia? First, the two-power alliance would have to decide on where to strike. For an invasion to be successful, both nations would have to land troops as quickly as possible, and that would require the use of a working seaport. These ports would require good rail and road infrastructure, and must have deep water anchorages so that large cargo ships could dock and disgorge troops and heavy equipment. The need to take and hold major seaports is critical, as aside from a few token forces with a small number of fire support platforms, amphibious landings alone wouldn't be able to deliver firepower fast enough to secure a beachhead. In Normandy during World War II, the success of the landings was largely down to a brilliant deception played out by the Allies, which saw the Nazis concentrate their forces at the wrong landing site. And even when the real landings happened 100 miles away, Nazi commanders were so fooled by Allied intelligence that they ordered their forces to hold their positions, believing that the real assault was coming their way any day. The ruse, combined with some whopping tactical blunders by Hitler, allowed the Allies to quickly build a makeshift port facility which let Allied armor and artillery disembark. Had Hitler allowed his commanders to commit panzer reinforcements to the landings, Normandy would have likely ended as a complete catastrophe for the Allies. By the time he cleared reserve panzer units for the assault on the beachheads, Allied logistical units had already disembarked enough tanks to repel the assault. In an invasion of the US homeland, such a ruse would be impossible to pull off. Long-range and satellite surveillance assets would see an invasion fleet days before it made landfall, and its target would be clearly known to the American defenders. Therefore, China and Russia would have to act quickly and decisively, taking major seaports and holding them long enough to disembark a sizable expeditionary force able to repel American counterassaults. For China, the only good options for unloading main battle tanks and mechanized artillery would be the ports in LA, Long Beach, Oakland, Tacoma, and Seattle. The LA Long Beach complex would be especially attractive as it's one of the world's largest ports and would allow Chinese forces to disembark very quickly. Unfortunately, these port facilities are also very close to several American air and naval bases, making them easily defended. The Seattle and Tacoma ports, however, are far more vulnerable, as only 5 major American bases are near these facilities. Landing in Washington, though, would mean Chinese forces would have to fight south and into California through easily defended and very mountainous terrain, a tactical nightmare for any Chinese commander. Russian invaders would face an even less enviable job. The American East Coast is home to far more numerous large port facilities, giving the Russian invasion force a greater number of targets to pick from. Unfortunately, the American East Coast is also the most heavily defended, with several dozen major military installations spread out from north to south. The East Coast is also home to America's largest military shipyards, which would be so heavily protected it would be suicidal to attempt a landing or assault against them. Russia's best bet would be to attempt a landing in Mobile, Alabama or Houston, Texas. This, however, would mean Russian forces would have to spend more time out at sea and move into the Gulf of Mexico, where they would be surrounded on all sides but the south by major American air bases. For both our challengers, the tactical picture is not looking very good, as the United States simply has no viable landing sites for a major expeditionary force that couldn't be easily defended. China and Russia could opt to coerce or bribe Mexico or Canada into allowing them to land at their facilities and launch an invasion into the US itself. This would be by far the best strategic option for the invasion forces, but in response to the agreement between either nation and the Sino-Russian alliance, the United States would immediately begin a large-scale bombing campaign against port facilities in Canada or Mexico, with every viable port being within easy reach of American bombers. Even before the invasion force crossed the ocean, they would be sailing for ports that have been turned into rubble. Assuming that the US didn't use naval aviation, which it definitely would, the invaders could opt for using ports in South America, well out of reach of most American bombers, and then simply move north to invade through Mexico. Moving through South America's poor rail and road infrastructure, though, would be a nightmare for the invaders, allowing plenty of time for the US to simply move blocking forces through Mexico to Panama and then hold off the invasion there. If, miraculously, though the alliance did manage to land forces in Canada or Mexico, it would face a different tactical nightmare altogether. In Canada, the lack of suitable border crossings would force the invaders to spread out over a large area, or bottleneck and be subjected to endless attacks by American air power. In Mexico, military border crossings would be possible over a far larger area, but enemy forces would be moving through terrain that provided absolutely no cover. American air power would once more devastate any invaders trying to move through the flat terrain of the US-Mexico border. Geography alone provides the United States with near invulnerability from enemy invasion, but the logistics of the world's militaries proves why the US simply cannot be invaded. An invasion of the American homeland would rely on naval power to get the job done. And right off the bat, no nation on Earth, nor any combination of nations, has the firepower and logistical support needed to carry out such an invasion. The matter is one of historical necessity for the world. Ever since the end of the Second World War, all of the world's major powers have had no need to project military power far from their own shores, except for the United States. The Soviet Union was chiefly concerned with securing its European borders, and in the case of a Third World War, its most vital strategic objectives could all be reached over land. The vitally important oil fields of the Middle East could all be taken via land routes through Afghanistan and Iran, and no navy was needed to hold off NATO forces in Europe. The same was true for Europe's NATO members. While once their mighty navies ruled the waves all over the world, their concerns in the 20th century quickly became resisting a possible Soviet invasion, and for that, no major naval power was needed. In the Atlantic, the Soviets hoped to slow the American response with the use of submarines, but ultimately knew that they could never stop the US Navy and thus never seriously tried. On the other side of the world, China struggles to turn itself into a first world power, and other than resentment towards Japan over its actions in World War II, China has had no real motivations to build a strong navy, at least until now. Much like the Soviet Union and Europe's NATO partners, though, China definitely had no real reason to build a heavy sea lift capability in order to move thousands of troops and heavy equipment across the ocean. On the other hand, the United States is both blessed and cursed by geography. While it's untouchable to invasion thanks to the Atlantic and the Pacific, it also means that in order to project power on the world stage, America has always needed a strong navy. This is the reason that the US has always had a very strong naval tradition, and why it has invested in naval and air transport more than any other nation on Earth. If US troops want to get somewhere, after all, they're certainly not walking there. To even get forces into the US, any invading army is going to need some serious sea lift capability, and no force on Earth comes even close to the US's 125-vessel Military Sea Lift Command, which operates a vast fleet of oilers, tankers, and heavy cargo transports. Yet, even this fleet is not enough according to some analysts, and plans are being called for that include dramatically increasing the capability of the US's military transport fleets. China has in recent years expanded its landing ship capabilities, with several dozen available to carry troops and heavy equipment. These ships, though, are not meant for global operations and are only designed for cross-strait invasions into Taiwan or to ferry supplies to China's illegal holdings in the artificial islands it built across the South China Sea. A crippling lack of support vessels such as oilers means that China cannot physically get its landing ships across the Pacific, though even if this problem were to be solved, the nation cannot hope to make a contested landing on foreign soil. Again, this is because of China's lack of need for a global expeditionary military force. China's chief military concerns lie with a military invasion and forced repatriation of Taiwan, and thus it has not invested money into developing a true blue water navy. Russia has even less naval transport capability and support vessels, which again is a result of its military objectives being close to home. To compound the two nations' sea lift problems, both nations have no dedicated amphibious assault ships capable of providing close air support and air superiority to landing forces on a contested beach. By comparison, the US operates 9 of these specialized vehicles, and they will soon be equipped with the F-35 stealth fighter. Projecting air power is in fact the biggest weakness for any nation hoping to invade the US, and China and Russia combined only operate 2 active-duty aircraft carriers of extremely limited capabilities. Russia's infamous Admiral Kuznetsov very publicly had to be towed back to a friendly port after experiencing severe mechanical problems. Without adequate air power, neither nation could expect to secure a foothold on the US mainland. America's air forces are twice as large as both nations combined, and its naval aviation alone is as large as Russia's total air power. If by some miracle either nation could get troops across the ocean to US shores, the lack of air power would reduce the attempted landings to a suicide mission. In the end, not only could the US protect from an invasion of the homeland, but it is currently and for the foreseeable future completely invulnerable to military invasion. Luckily, the US, China, and Russia have no desire to fight each other, and there exists no real reason to. You died. Bummer. Unfortunately, you're not quite ready to move on, so you decide to stick around for a while and keep an eye on your physical body. Little do you know, you're about to witness firsthand many of the funeral home secrets they don't want you to know. Since you're fairly young and your death was rather unexpected, you're going to need a post-mortem exam. And that's why you find yourself, or rather your body, safely stored in a freezer in the morgue in the basement of your local hospital. You watch with interest as the doctor removes your body from the freezer and prepares it for the post-mortem exam. They start with an external exam, looking for any obvious signs of injury or recent medical care, and taking note of any defining marks, like your freckles and tattoos. Your doctor dons a strange-looking face shield to start the internal exam, which seems a bit overkill to you, until he reaches for the saw. The doctor uses the saw to cut open your abdomen, from your pubic bone all the way up to your sternum, and to cut through your ribs to expose your chest cavity. At least they're careful not to cut too high so that your loved ones won't have to see evidence of the post-mortem exam during your funeral. You can't stop watching as the doctor proceeds to remove your organs one by one so that he can examine each of them by turn. They work in 3 blocks, starting with the thoracic area. First, they remove your lungs and heart, then loosen the skin up to your chin to get at your tongue and throat without leaving visible marks. Thanks, I guess. Next, they remove your liver, pancreas, stomach, and kidneys, and they finally take out your bladder, bowels, and reproductive organs. Now that your body is an empty cavity, the doctor turns their attention to your organs and examines each of them in turn. You find it hard to pay attention to what's happening on the bench, though, when your body is just laying there, empty. The doctor doesn't find any obvious damage to any of your organs, so they take samples to send for analysis, including a toxicology screening. After the samples are prepared, the doctor carefully returns your organs to your body, roughly where they belong, then carefully sews up your incisions. You're a little bit surprised to see that they also clean your body to remove any evidence of the post-mortem, and they even wash your hair for you. Finally, the doctor completes their report and releases your body to the funeral home. 2 attendants arrive to transport your body to the funeral home. They load up your body into a stretcher and gather up your clothes and personal belongings. You're relieved to see that your wallet makes it untouched into the bag with your possessions. But then, "Hey," says one of the attendants, "this guy has a full Metro pass in his pocket. That has to be worth at least $50. I'm keeping this, not like he's gonna miss it." They both have a good laugh at that as they wheel your body and belongings out to the waiting hearse. After a pretty bumpy ride, you follow your body into the funeral home and into yet another freezer. Who knew death was so chilly? Well, you'd better get comfortable. This is your home until the results of the post-mortem come in. Then your death can be registered and your embalming can begin. A little while later, you're not sure if it's hours or days. Time is pretty weird when you're dead. Your body is once again pulled from the freezer and placed on a table in the funeral home's dedicated embalming room. The funeral director comes in with the embalmer, chatting about the arrangements for your funeral. The public viewing is in 2 days, so we need the embalming done in time for the private family viewing tomorrow night. says the funeral director. No problem, says the embalmer. Did you tell them that embalming wasn't actually necessary, especially I could keep him on ice until the viewing and put a plastic suit under his clothes to manage seepage? It's cheaper, especially if they're just gonna cremate him. Of course not, said the funeral director. Can't have that getting out, that would ruin us. They both have a good laugh while you look on fuming. Since there's not much you can do about it, you are a ghost after all, you settle in to watch the embalming process. Besides, you didn't like the sounds of seepage. First, the embalmer unwraps your body, then cleans it thoroughly with a disinfectant spray. Rigor mortis has set in, making all your limbs stiff and hard to work with, so they spend some time massaging your limbs to work it out. Then they make a small incision in your groin and fill your body with formaldehyde. As you watch the formaldehyde flow through your body, you're shocked to see your body begin to plump up and get more color. You're actually starting to look more lifelike. Creepy. Next, the embalmer makes another incision, this time under your ribcage, and inserts a metal suction tool called a trocar attached to a pump system in your chest cavity. You watch with horror as they use the trocar to puncture each of your organs and drain them of fluid, including your bladder and bowels. Yuck. Thankfully, the embalmer is wearing gloves and a mask, and the suction system is airtight, so none of the fluid comes in contact with the embalmer. Once your body is completely drained, the embalmer refills it with a liter of fluid, which saturates your organs and mitigates any nasty smells. Now that the embalming is complete, it's time to prepare your body for your viewing. You find it hard to watch the embalmer stuff your nose and throat with cotton to prevent any smells or fluids from leaking out, but even worse is watching them dry out your eyeballs. This is an important step though, and if it's skipped, it can lead to liquid seeping from your eyes, which might look like tears to your horrified family. After drying them, plastic half-moon caps are placed under your eyelids to keep them from collapsing into your skull, and your eyelids are glued shut. The final indignity, though, comes when they get ready to dress your body. After a thorough cleaning, to your dismay, the first item they put on you is an adult diaper. This is meant to protect the coffin and your clothes, not to mention your loved ones from any leakage, but that doesn't make it any easier to watch. Last but not least, your hair is styled, your nose and ear hair is trimmed, and some light makeup is applied. Your body's even treated to a last manicure. Finally, you're dressed in your best suit, and you have to admit you look pretty darn good for a dead guy. After the embalmer leaves, 2 attendants enter the room wheeling a coffin on a stand. You recognize one of the attendants from the hospital. He's the sneaky bus pass thief. You don't recognize the other one. He vaguely looks uneasy about being so close to your body, so you conclude that he must be new. Your suspicions are confirmed a few minutes later when the bus pass thief nods toward the coffin and says, "Okay, newbie, go open the lid so we can get this body loaded." The newbie edges closer to your casket, keeping one eye on your body the whole time, as if he half expects you to sit up at any minute. As he reaches out a hand to open the casket, the lid flies open and a body sits up and reaches for him. He runs from the room screaming bloody murder, and you have a feeling he won't be back. "Did you see him run? What a scaredy cat," says the man sitting in the coffin, who you now recognize as the other attendant from the hospital. "I knew he wasn't cut out for this job. Good riddance," says the other. "Okay, get out and help me with him." Finally, they carefully place you into your coffin and wheel you out into the visitation space. You have a lovely service full of family and friends, and you're happy to see that it seems to bring some closure. But you're not quite ready to move on. You've heard terrible rumors about what happens in crematoriums, so you're going to stick with your body for a little while longer and see for yourself. After another bumpy hearse ride, your casket arrives at the crematorium. The crematory operator takes a numbered card from your coffin and places it on a board next to what looks like a large furnace. You realize that this is how they make sure that they know whose remains come out the other end. The operator opens the coffin and checks your body. You see him notice your watch, and then watch in horror as he leans in and removes it from your body. How many times do I have to tell those dummies at the funeral home to remove the watches before they drop them off? Don't they know that watch batteries can explode in the cremator? You feel a bit better, but still resolve to keep an eye on your watch from now on. Not that you can do much about it. The operator starts the cremator by turning on the gas and heating the chamber to a scorching 750 degrees Celsius. All the while, they're monitoring the systems by the computer. You see a screen full of readings for temperature, emissions, and oxygen levels, but it means nothing to you. You realize that this must be a much more complex process than you thought. Before you know it, the cremator is ready. This is the part you were worried about. You've heard stories of funeral homes stealing coffins and reselling them, but your fears are soon calmed when you overhear the operator talking to his assistant as they load your body, casket and all, into the furnace. "I'm glad this guy's family didn't cheap out on the coffin and go for one of those cardboard boxes," they say. "Those things are so inefficient. The wood from the coffin burns first, which helps create the perfect heat and burning environment for an efficient and even cremation. There. they say as they shut the door to the cremator. "That was a pretty small one. Let's give it an hour or so." After an hour has passed, the operator returns to check on the progress. They peek through a window in the side of the chamber and announce that the cremation process is done. You can't resist sneaking a peek yourself, but all that you can see is a glowing pile of ashes. The operator shuts down the machine and leaves the assistant with the unenviable task of raking out the remains. Once the machine is cooled down, the assistant uses a 15-foot-long steel rake to push the remains through an opening in the bottom of the cremator and into a bin to cool. Finally, the assistant picks through the bin of the cooled remains, taking out any metal hardware left over from the coffin. When he's done, you notice there are still some large chunks in the mixture, and you worry that he missed some hinges or screws. The operator sets you straight when they return to inspect the remains. "Good job, I think you got everything. Looks like we have some bone fragments, maybe a piece of a hip or a shin bone. That's to be expected, the bigger bones don't always break right down. And those young bones are stronger after all. Don't worry, the cremulator will take care of them." You barely have time to register this bit of gruesome news before the assistant whisks the bin of your remains over to the cremulator. A cremulator, as it turns out, is a machine that uses steel balls to grind the remains into a fine, uniform ash and filters out any unsightly bigger pieces. Once the cremulator has done its job, your remains are transferred to the beautiful decorative urn that your relatives have selected and placed in a storage room to await pickup. You're relieved to see that your watch is placed alongside your urn, and at least it didn't go missing. Satisfied that your body has been properly and respectfully dealt with, you finally decide that it's time to leave and go explore the rest of what the other side has to offer. Your soul is at peace now that you've learned the funeral home's secrets they don't want you to know. March 5th, 1944, the Burmese jungle, U.S. Army 849th Engineer Aviation Battalion Camp. "Get back!" yelled 21-year-old Private Herman Perry. He stood in the road brandishing his M1 Grand rifle. Lieutenant Katie ignored the warning and stepped closer. Sweating, sobbing, probably coming off an opium high, Perry was losing it, having a breakdown. He wasn't going to let Katie take him into custody. He wasn't going to do more time at the parasite-infested hellhole known as the Lido Stockade. Despite Perry's erratic behavior, Katie wasn't about to back off. This boy had a smart mouth. He'd been AWOL. He was a troublemaker. He needed to be punished. Besides, there was no way that Perry would shoot. That would be suicidal. Now less than a foot away from Perry, Katie stretched out a hand toward him. Bam! Katie jerked and crumpled to the ground. For a split second, everyone stared in disbelief at the fatally wounded Katie. Then Perry swung his gun around and trained it on the other officers as he backed away down the road. As he neared the trees, he turned and ran, vanishing into the brush. During World War II, the United States segregated its armed forces. Sure, there were a couple of African-American combat units created mainly for political reasons, but the majority of African Americans who served were relegated to menial tasks including cooking, cleaning, and construction. That's how close to 10,000 African Americans ended up being shipped to Burma. These men are stationed there to build what will end up being a boondoggle, a 1,072-mile supply road to run through the Burmese jungle connecting Lido, India to Kunming, China. Some 5,000 white Americans are also sent to work on the Lido Road. However, many of them are officers overseeing the black soldiers. The Burmese jungle is torturous. It's hot, humid, the vegetation's dense, the terrain is rough, it's easy to get malaria or dysentery, and it's hard to avoid the leeches, lice, and mosquitoes. Even worse, sometimes man-eating tigers lurk in the brush, clothes rot, and the food rations are poor. Building the Lido Road is back-breaking, far harder than Perry's North Carolinian childhood of picking cotton in a sharecropping family. The soldiers have mandatory 16-hour shifts. Bulldozers supplied by the Army quickly break down, and the GIs are forced into manual labor. They use hoes and pickaxes to dig the muddy, rocky red soil. Many of the black soldiers work side by side and become friendly with coolies, unskilled native laborers. As a result, the black soldiers pick up bush lingo, Urdu, and Hindi. They trade in the local black markets for moonshine known as jungle juice. Some soldiers, including Perry, seek solace from the grim drudgery of their lives in opium and marijuana. When Katie was attempting to take him into custody, Perry was coming off a 2-day drug bender. After shooting Katie, a panicked Perry runs into the jungle. Oh God, he killed someone. For 3 days, Perry stumbles through the jungle in a daze. Not knowing what to do, he veers back to the Lido Road. He runs into some soldiers from a different unit working on the road. They feed him and pass along messages from his friends in the 849th Battalion. Military police are looking for him. Perry decides to surrender. At nightfall, he stands by a bridge for the Namyung River. Sooner or later, a patrol will come by and he'll turn himself in. While waiting, Perry sits down his rifle. Hearing gunshots somewhere nearby, Perry gets worried the MPs are gunning for him and they'll kill him outright instead of arresting him. Spooked, he slips into the jungle again, accidentally leaving his gun behind. Perry spends several days wandering in the jungle. Luckily, he speaks some bush lingo, which allows him to beg for rice from Naga farmers. The Naga are an ethnic group native to northeastern India and northwestern Burma. Some of the tribes live remotely and stick to traditional practices, including headhunting. For the most part, the British and Americans ignore the Naga as long as they stick to making war on each other and not Westerners. March 18th. Around 2 weeks after he'd killed Katie and fled into the jungle, Perry runs into some British troops. Perry, who's always been a smooth talker, thinks fast and makes up excuses as to why he's alone in the jungle. He's able to charm the Brits into giving him some food rations. It's hard going trekking through the remote Patkai's foothills, but the farther away Perry gets from the army, the better. One day, Perry's hiking up a dense mountain slope when he sees something spine-chilling, a basha, or temporary shelter often made with bamboo. This basha is decorated with human skulls, to which water buffalo horns have been attached. Perry has stumbled into the head-hunting Naga village of Tumga. Believe it or not, Perry delights the villagers by giving them the remaining canned food rations he got from the British. The Ang, or village chief, invites him to be his honored guest. Perry takes a liking to the chief's 14-year-old daughter. She seems to return his interest. Perry has a new problem. How do you flirt with a girl and impress her warrior father when you don't know the culture or speak the language? The answer is gifts. Perry hikes some 8 miles down the mountain back to the Lido Road. Somehow he manages to get a hold of a load of army goods. Most importantly, he gets an M1 Garand. In Naga culture, tiger pelts and claws are prized. The act of killing a tiger is seen as a virile feat of masculinity. Compared to the clubs and flintlocks the Naga have, with his modern gun, Perry is seen as having the ability to kill many a tiger. The village is impressed. Perry is considered an important man, and the chief allows Perry to marry his daughter. The first few months of Perry's married life are pretty good. He struggles with malaria, but due to his stockpile of army rations, he's rich enough to hire servants to work his fields. Perry spends much of his time hunting monkeys and tigers. He grows fluent in his wife's language. The couple's excited to find out that they're expecting their first child. Many nights, the tribal musicians play flutes and drums while the tribe chants, takes psychoactives, and dances. Meanwhile, the army has offered a 1,000 rupee reward for information leading to Perry's capture. That's upwards of $14,500 in today's money. They assume that he's headed for the city, so they've been searching for him in Calcutta. The legend of Perry is beginning to grow. Warranted or not, he's becoming a folk hero. To the black GIs who stew with the resentment of daily petty racial humiliations, Perry is awesome. Apropos of what actually happened, they see Perry as someone who fought back against the man and won. Eventually, Perry becomes homesick. When he was drafted into the army, he left behind a young daughter and a girlfriend in Washington, D.C. Also, his stockpile of rations is quickly dwindling. He begins to hunger for Western items, especially cigarettes. He hires runners to go down the mountain to trade at the black market in rural towns. Finally, the army finds a clue. In the summer, some 5 months after Perry vanished, a coolie finds the rifle Perry accidentally left behind when he panicked at the bridge. The army realizes they've been searching in the wrong place. They put out feelers in rural towns near where the gun was found. Eventually, a rumor reaches their ears about the chief of Tumga having a black soldier as a son-in-law. Army brass is incredulous. They never would have expected an unarmed tenderfoot like Perry to survive for so long in the jungle. A runner who had gone to the town of Namyong to get rice quickly comes back to tell Perry that there are men searching for him. Perry leaves his wife in Tumga and goes to Noksa, or a satellite village. July 20th. Captain Walter McMinn and a small posse of MPs, along with hired Naga guides, go on a 3.5-hour hike up the mountain to Tumga. None of the Americans speak any Naga. They use a picture of Perry and hand signs to communicate. The posse learns that Perry's gone to the Noksa. By the time that the posse huddles outside of the Noksa making a plan, it's twilight. The MPs get a guide to go ask Perry to borrow his gun for a hunt. The ploy works. It's a common request and Perry agrees, which leaves him unarmed. Army snipers sneak through the brush and position themselves around Perry's basha. They have to be careful. It would be diplomatically unwise to accidentally kill any Naga. While eating dinner, Perry sees flickers of light outside. The Naga don't have flashlights. It can only mean Westerners. Perry thinks about trying to sneak into the pitch-black jungle behind the village, but tigers have recently been a problem. He grabs a dao, or short Chinese sword, and lights a bamboo staff to use as a torch. Getting up his nerve, Perry goes outside. McMinn immediately blinds Perry with his flashlight, ordering him not to move. McMinn fires, but misses. Perry takes off, and the soldiers chase him, shooting as they go. Perry seems to vanish into the jungle, escaping the ambush, but then they find his body at the bottom of a hill. Perry's been shot in the chest. Around 10 p.m., McMinn hikes several hours back to Namyang to get a doctor and more soldiers. Even with the extra manpower, it ends up being a 9-hour ordeal to carry the stretcher bearing the 170-pound severely injured Perry down the mountain to reach Lido Road. From there, an ambulance takes Perry to the 73rd Evacuation Hospital at Xingbuyang. Perry spends the next several days recovering. While Perry's hyped up on morphine and other medical drugs, he's frequently interrogated. At first, he denies being Perry, but then finally admits his identity and confesses to shooting Katie. He's coerced into signing a 3-page document that he's told is a statement of what had happened, though Perry thinks some key facts are missing or distorted. Against his better judgment, he notarizes and signs the paperwork. On August 28th, Perry is deemed healthy enough to be transferred to prison. He's sent to the notorious Lido Stockade, the very prison he was trying to evade when he shot Katie in the first place. This is his second stint in the stockade. Several months before the whole shooting incident, Perry had spent hellish months in Lido, convicted for disobeying orders when an officer tried to assign him extra work. Though Perry's sentence for disobedience was 90 days, he'd been forced to serve an extra couple of weeks in the stockade without an explanation. The army assigns Perry a lawyer, Captain Clayton Oberholzer. Unfortunately for Perry, Oberholzer only has experience as a civilian lawyer and has never handled a felony. The fact that Perry killed Katie is indisputable, but Oberholzer hopes to get the charges reduced from premeditated capital murder to manslaughter, the difference being life in prison versus execution if convicted. Perry is also accused of desertion and willful disobedience. September 4th, 1944. Perry's court-martial takes less than 6 hours. Oberholzer fumbles a chance to get the sworn statement Perry made while drugged tossed. He botches explaining that the morning of the murder, a distraught Perry was headed to see Lieutenant Colonel Hyatt, the commander of the camp, who had an open-door policy to chat with the soldiers, white or black. Katie went out of his way to accost Perry with the intent to take him into custody, consciously seeking to prevent him from seeing Hyatt, who might have limited Perry's punishment for going AWOL. When Oberholzer brings up Katie's history of abuse toward black GIs, the tribunal warns him that Katie's character isn't on trial. The vote is unanimous. Perry is dishonorably discharged, must forfeit all pay, and will be hanged by the neck until dead. As part of the Army's due process, the verdict condemning Perry to death must undergo a review by 3 members of the Judge Advocate General's Department in New Delhi. All the way across the world, Perry's mom gets a letter from the Army informing her that her son has been court-martialed, convicted of murder, and is sentenced to hang. Bewildered and frightened, she scraps together some money and hires the best lawyer she can get. Her lawyer submits a brief to the Washington-based office of the Judge Advocate General's Department. The Washington office informs New Delhi that a brief for the Perry case will shortly arrive in the mail. Nearly a month later, on December 15th, the New Delhi office transmits a classified message asking about the brief. It hasn't arrived. It's been lost in the mail. Meanwhile, Perry has been stuck in limbo, imprisoned in Lido Stockade. He spent his time watching and memorizing guard schedules. Then, on December 15th, Perry makes his move. Late at night, he crawls under the rear of his tent. The sleepy soldier standing guard at the entrance to his tent doesn't notice. Perry only has 11 minutes before the next time the guards make a circuit. Using wire cutters he stole while on work detail, he quickly cuts a hole in the prison fence just big enough to wiggle through. Protected by strips of coarse wool cut from his prison issue blanket, Perry crawls through the drainage ditches filled with barbed wire. After that, he runs through a field at the stockade's edge and disappears into the jungle. Sweet freedom. Perry stops to catch his breath. He's free, but some 80 miles of mountainous jungle separates him from his wife and unborn child. How's he gonna get home? Army brass loses their minds when they realize that Perry has escaped. The Lido Stockade's warden and 8 guards are formally reprimanded for negligence. The Army again puts a 1,000 rupee bounty on Perry's head. They radio broadcast Perry's description in several languages and print wanted posters. By airplane, they drop some posters on the village of Tkumga. The illiterate Naga villagers collect them, impressed that pictures of the chief's son-in-law are falling from the heavens. MPs begin stopping black soldiers at random based on the chances that they might be helping Perry. Whenever they can, many black soldiers tear up the wanted posters. They enjoy swapping tales and rumors of the Jungle King. The law brief in defense of Perry finally reaches New Delhi on December 27th. The advocate judge's review finds some of the Army's actions questionable, but reconfirms the verdict of execution. In the wee hours of January 1st, 1945, Perry is almost caught at an abandoned timber camp by a posse of MPs who had heard rumors of a black soldier hiding there. Luckily for Perry, he's a light sleeper and escapes into the jungle just in time. A bullet barely grazes him. The MPs recover a .45 pistol Perry accidentally left behind. February 19th. Two black soldiers, Staff Sergeant Toomer and T4 Troxler, are buying liquor in the town of Macomb when Perry suddenly storms the bootlegger's shack. Somehow he's gotten a replacement .45 pistol. He mugs the two soldiers of 95 rupees and forces the bootlegger to cook him dinner. Perry asks Toomer and Troxler to do him a favor. He wants them to bring a truck stocked with rations, clothes, a tent, a knife, and ammunition in the next 24 hours. They agree to meet Perry in Macomb the following night. Even though he stole money from them, Toomer and Troxler debate what to do. Ultimately, they decide to tell the Army, mainly out of fear of what could happen to them if the Army found out that they had suppressed information about Perry. They inform Major Earl Owen Cullum, commanding officer of the 159th Military Police Battalion at nearby Chapo camp. Cullum decides to set up a trap. The soldiers will arrive with the truck and the Army will ambush Perry. Toomer and Troxler agree to help as long as the Army keeps it a secret that they betrayed the Jungle King. However, Perry has anticipated a trap. A crowd of coolies shows up to meet Toomer and Troxler. The Army doesn't see Perry, but even if he's there, they can't shoot without risking a diplomatic incident. Suddenly, from among the crowd, Perry sprints for the truck and hops aboard. He forces Toomer and Troxler to drive away down the road, but there's a snag. A checkpoint's coming up. Perry gets out of the truck to trek through the jungle around the checkpoint. Toomer directs Perry to meet them at a grassy field on the far side. Perry doesn't know that this is the Army's Plan B. As he reaches the field, MPs fire at Perry, but again he escapes into the jungle. This time he's wounded. A bullet nicked his right foot. He packs it full of moss so it won't get infected, a trick he learned from the Naga. Perry limps through the jungle and hides in a rice paddy. Hours later, he awakes to the barking of German shepherds. The Army's caught up to him. Perry escapes yet again. This time, the tip of his nose gets grazed by a bullet. He puts moss on this wound too. Cullum receives a scolding note from his commanding officer for letting Perry get away. Cullum vows to capture Perry. February 22nd. A desperate Perry hides by the side of the Lido Road. His new plan is to board a truck, hide among the supplies, and hitch a ride over the mountains. When the truck reaches Burma, he'll ditch it and disappear into the jungle. But Perry is unwell. The gunshot on his foot is very painful. Also, he's had to drink river water and has caught dysentery. When Perry tries to hop on the back of a slow-moving truck, he's too weak and falls in the road, dropping yet another .45. The gun skids further away as it hits the ground. Perry realizes that a coolie has witnessed his failed hijack attempt. Spooked, he quickly melts back into the jungle. For the third time, he leaves a gun behind. Cullum starts a mobile posse to hunt Perry. He begins visiting town after town to question locals. He also coordinates with the British and native police forces. He and his fellow posse follow Perry's trail for over 2 weeks. Cullum eventually figures out that Perry's headed in the direction of the town of Namrup. Perry's following the southeastern branch of the Tsang River. It's a long, indirect route to Tunga. However, Perry's probably taking this way because just south of Namrup is considered the gateway to the Naga heartland. Here, Perry would be able to make friends. Chances are some of the Naga tribes speak the same language as Perry's wife. Cullum realizes he has only a few days to catch up with Perry before he vanishes into a remote area again, maybe this time forever. Meanwhile, Perry's been growing weaker by the day from dysentery and malnutrition. He's surviving on stolen sugarcane and begging farmers for rice. Stupidly, Toomer and Troxler mention they're snitching on Perry to a colleague. The Army has to evacuate them from Asia over threats of murder from Perry's fans. After a long, rough journey, the posse arrives in Namrup. Cullum receives a tip as to where Perry is. He's staying at a rural farm a few miles away. The posse waits until nightfall before hiking to the farm. Cautiously, the posse fans out and surrounds the farmer's basha. They find 3 Naga tribesmen wearing traditional dhotis sitting by a fire outside of the home. Cullum senses that there's something not quite right. He takes a closer look at the men. He then grabs one of them. It's Perry. He cut his afro and borrowed native clothing, hoping that he can pass for Naga by firelight. For the last time, Perry is taken into custody. Under tight security, a sickly Perry is transported to the Chapo stockade and kept in an isolation cell. The army decides not to return him to Lido stockade. They fear a potential racial uprising. Perry's interrogated by MPs who want to know where he got his guns. Perry refuses to snitch. He's sorry over Katie's death, but also says that he would have killed his pursuers if he had a chance. March 15, 1945. A few days after his capture, Perry is woken before dawn and under extremely tight security transported to Lido stockade. Per his last request, Perry is allowed to write a farewell letter to his brother Aaron and given a final cigarette before he's quietly hanged just after 7 a.m. March 17th. Perry's mother receives a notice from the army informing her of her son's death by judicial asphyxiation due to his own misconduct. Despite repeated requests for information, she hasn't heard anything since her lawyer submitted the brief in December. She knows nothing of her son's escapades or anti-hero status. Some months later, a small group of black GIs are on an expedition through the Patkai Mountains to check for survivors of a crashed cargo plane. They hire some Naga guides and end up spending the night at a remote village where one of the guides' relatives lives. As guests, the GI are served a special treat for dessert, canned fruit cocktail. One of the soldiers curiously inquires as to where the cocktail has come from. The next morning, before they leave, the soldiers are taken to the only basha in the village, painted a bright yellow-orange. It turns out to be owned by the chief's teenage daughter. Inside, the walls are decorated with wanted posters of Perry. The dwelling is filled with a stockpile of army goods. The young mom proudly shows off her curly-haired 6-month-old son. Wow, that was a wild ride. And now that you reached the end of our video, why not keep the watch party going? For another crazy story of a soldier surviving in the jungle, check out the story of Aussie Robert McLaren, who performed emergency surgery on himself. Or if you're interested in famous battles, you'll enjoy our video about the amazing Battle of the Bulge. Don't wait, click now.